And now that discussion, foreshadowing some of the problems of the winter and the future. A lot of interesting results have been coming through our computer there behind me. So let's have a little look at them. The Isle of Ely, here's Clement Freud holding off the challenge of Dr. Tom Stutterford, who chose to fight there rather than in Norwich South.
But a very big drop in his majority from 8,000 to 2,300, down 7%, mainly to Labour.
And now John Pardoe's result from North Cornwall. Mr. Pardoe adjudged one of the stars of the campaign.
Again, down from 8,000 to 3,000. The Labour Party loses its deposit. In fact, his drop is about equally to Conservative and Labour.
And now here's Mr. John Spence, who was the Conservative MP briefly for Sheffield Heeley, but he's now safely back in Thirsk.
Labour almost gets back into second place.
Here's an interesting result now. This is one of the Liberal hopes, but Burnaby Drayson, who's held that seat since 1945, has scraped back.
The Liberals increased their vote there, but not quite enough.
And Alec Buchanan Smith, who had been thought to be in some trouble in Angus North and Mearns, because remember South Angus went last night, shadow spokesman for Scotland, he's back, but a bit of a fight.
11% jump in the vote there, but these funds have cleared out a great many of the uncertainties about Liberals and Nationalists.
It looks as though the Liberal damaged the Nationalists there in North Angus and Mearns, incidentally. Now here's Edward Buchanan in Taunton, chairman of the 22 Committee, Conservative Backbench Committee.
The asterisk means that Mr. Buchanan is elected, and the dash means that Mr. Bradford loses his deposit.
And we have now over 540 results in, and with a recount going on at Beeston, well, that's one of what we must call the David Butler 4, and we'll wait and see what happens. In Stratford-on-Avon, Angus Maud is back. Now we're getting this rush of lunchtime results, and not bringing enormous hopes for the Labour Party, considering that the Conservatives in the end held Derbyshire South East, but Labour hopes now pinned on Beeston. Well, now, Graham, what are you saying to it?
Well, we've less than 100 results to go now, and the prediction is still that Labour are going to get 320, Conservatives 276, Liberals 12, and others 27. That means a Labour majority overall of 5 seats. Now, it could be less, and 1 seat going the other way would reduce that Labour overall majority from 5 to 3. And I think, therefore, it's important to realise that the overall majority is a very sensitive figure. And, for example, the recount we just heard about could well be the one that we're waiting for to give us the flip, either to confirm the 5 or to go to the 3.
Well, David, is this the last remaining one for you?
No. Well, there are 4 seats, I think, 5 that I'm really looking for, possibly Labour gains. Bosworth, which is their best bet, I think. Braintree, not so good a bet. Beeston, where we know there's a recount. South East Derbyshire, where we know there's a recount.
That's held by a Conservative now.
Beeston.
Sorry, no, South East Derbyshire, I believe, is held by the Conservative.
Well, that reduces. There are only 3 seats I think Labour could gain, and they've got to hold on to Caithness and Sutherland as the one conceivable loss in the north of Scotland, where anything may happen.
Well, if Mr. Wilson is, in fact, watching, he's no doubt, and if he attaches considerable importance to an overall majority of any kind, it must be a slightly nervous lunch, I would have thought, at this particular moment. The normal safe seats are continuing to come in at the same time. Esher held by the Conservatives, Don Valley, another big mining constituency, a very safe Labour one, held by Mr. Wilson for Labour, as the confirmation of that. I think that the Skipton result is a bad reverse for the Liberals. I think they had hoped very much. They had been sweating down Mr. Burnaby Drayson's majority there over the years, and if they were to do something there in Skipton, as they had done, Richard Wainwright had done in the Colne Valley on the other side of the Pennines, this was the way in which they were going to break into Yorkshire. But I'm afraid Claire Brooks failed to do that.
They got it down to a 3-figure majority. One of the things, this election will leave quite a large number of seats where Conservatives are sweating on Liberals, breathing very close down behind them. There were more, actually, very close results after this election than there were before.
It's the sort of result that would have put the cat among the pigeons if the Conservatives and the Liberals had been in a position to form any kind of a coalition government, because someone like Mrs. Brooks is very strongly opposed to that at the Liberal Party Assembly, largely because she spent her political life fighting a Conservative.
I think that would be there. We aren't really in any position to spend much time speculating about Conservative-Liberal deals, except in relation to the next election and thereafter, because Mr. Wilson does. We're talking about whether he's going to get a majority of 1 or 3 or 5, but...
Here's Mr. Wilson coming out from Lord North Street, and just taking a little stroll down the road. It's a neighbourhood of small houses, but fairly expensive ones. It's a salubrious neighbourhood, very convenient indeed for him, of course, because it is so close both to the House of Commons, where one of his offices is, his factory floor, so to speak, and also to number 10 Downing Street. And here he is with Mrs. Wilson taking the air back in London.
I think he's walking with Ron Hayward over to Transport House.
Well, this is the promised visit. Yes, Ron Hayward is there with him. And this is the promised visit that he's going to pay to thank the party workers at the Labour Party headquarters. Faithfully, at the end of each election campaign, and Mr. Wilson now has many successful election campaigns behind him, he does pay this visit. And sometimes it's possible for him to be doorstepped as he goes in. Stopped on the doorstep by a reporter with a microphone. Keith Graves is our reporter there. And he may say an encouraging word or a discouraging word. When Labour were trying to see how they could work out a minority government back in March, there weren't too many encouraging words from Labour leaders when they arrived. But here's Mr. Wilson in a very affable mood indeed. A slow procession down Lord North Street. Well, we'll pick him up if he does in fact turn up at the door of Transport House. We have no more results actually coming in now. It may even be that people are knocking off for lunch on some of these counts at 25 to 1. Oh well, we saw Falmouth and Camborne, and Banbury has now been held by the Conservatives. It is, of course, the seat of a prominent anti-marketeer.
Falmouth and Camborne was one of those very outside possibilities of a Labour gain. It was once a Labour seat for the first 20 years after the war. 25 years after the war, it hasn't gone, and so really there are hardly any seats that can change. We are focusing on Beeston, Braintree and Bosworth, and Beeston and Bosworth being the key ones, and Beeston we know there's a recount going on in.
So it's the 3 Bs there, without actually worrying about going up to Caithness and Sutherland. Well, alliteration coming in. And I think we have Mr. Wilson again. Yes, here he is with Ron Hayward on his right, on his left. Mrs. Wilson coming across the road, coming up, pointing out the way, and with suitably accompanied. Make sure, well-wishers shaking hands all round. Keith Graves should be waiting at the door of Transport House or just inside the hall, and just as soon as we see him, he will take up the commentary. And Mr. Wilson, you see his back view proceeding. Quite a rapid little walk now, not a saunter. And cameras around him, all the glare of victory and success. How used he is to it. And how used he is to chatting to photographers. And how used he is to telling news editors that they don't use the best pictures of him. Here he is now, arriving to the cheers of the Labour Party workers at the door of Transport House. And Robin Day. Robin, I think now we've had a little word with people in Brussels, but in our Paris studio is Monsieur Couve de Morville, a former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of France. Robin?
Bonjour, Monsieur Couve de Morville.
Bonjour, Monsieur Robin.
Very kind of you to join us on the programme. Were you one of those Europeans who was hoping for a more decisive Labour victory than this in order to get the common market question finally settled?
Well, I don't know, you see, what is the final results of your election.
It looks like a small majority.
Yes, which means that the Wilson government will go on, and that it will go on, of course, with the policy that they had built since the beginning of this year, and that was exposed in the campaign, which means, as regards the common market, revision of the terms of entry in order to ascertain whether Britain will stay or will not stay in the common market, that being decided finally by a sort of plebiscite. Is that right?
Monsieur Couve de Morville, if you were in charge of French affairs now, would you seek to make it easier for Mr. Wilson to keep Britain in?
Well, you see, it's very difficult to answer your question because really nobody knows exactly what is the British position. I mean by that everybody, or rather every party, in Britain is divided on the subject. The Conservative Party is divided, the Labour Party is divided. Nobody knows exactly where we stand. It seems to me that whether you are against or whether you are for, everybody wants to stay in order to be in.
But do you think...
But then on what terms? That is the question.
Yes, of course, Mr. Callaghan is not now seeking to renegotiate the treaties. So, I mean, the area of negotiation, renegotiation, is smaller than was at first envisaged.
Well, nobody knows exactly where we stand because it has been forgotten for the last months. Callaghan made a statement in, I think it was in the spring, and then it was a little discussed in Luxembourg, and then it was decided to look after the thing, and it was forgotten.
Can I just ask you this? How much do you think it matters now to Europe? Will you stay with us, Monsieur Couve de Murville? We have to go to one of our results in Scotland.
Yes, please.
Alistair Dow,
Liberal.
2,232 votes. Douglas Henderson,
SNP.
16,304 votes. Keith William Twort Raffin,
Conservative.
11,933 votes. Sarah Beverly Sissons,
Labour.
3,173 votes.
And that is the result, the return of Douglas Henderson, who is the Scottish National Whip, spokesman on finance, trade and industry, a management consultant holding his seat in Aberdeenshire East.
A virtually unchanged share of the vote.
What is he now?
And Mr. Douglas Henderson, one of the more impressive figures of the Scottish National Party, but we interrupted you, Robin, with Monsieur Couve de Murville.
Yes, Monsieur Couve de Murville, I'm sorry about that. Can I just ask you this? How much do you think it matters now to the European community whether Britain is in or out?
Well, you see, you can't answer that question right away, because it all depends on what Britain itself is wanting to do or wanting to accept.
But don't
If it is for a revision of the treaty and all that, well, of course, it's very different if Britain just wanted a few clauses to be changed.
But
and we don't know.
Could I suggest to you that as one who was a strong colleague and collaborator of General de Gaulle in his attitude to British entry, don't you think now that the increasing dominance of Germany in the common market strengthens the case from the French point of view for the continuing membership of Britain?
I was never of those who wanted to have Britain in order to counterbalance Germany.
But isn't the
I mean,
position
we are
different
in a
now?
community where we are partners and everybody is equal and everybody is treated the same way. And I don't want in any way to oppose Britain and Germany, and if I did want, it would be totally unrealistic. So I think it's a different thing. And if you want me to express an opinion on that, I would say that the bad thing is not that Germany at present is strong. The bad thing is that Britain and France are weak. And what has to be changed is that British and French weakness into a British and French strength.
But the logic of that is that if Britain were to stay in, then combined with France, there would be a greater strength to counterbalance Germany.
No, this is not a power game.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur Couve de Murville.
And now we have some full results, including a very interesting one which came in while that conversation was going on. Robert McClelland, a pro-European, promising young Labour member, holding Caithness and Sullivan.
And the SNP take second place, push Liberals into third place in this seat that was a Liberal seat 10 years ago.
And now the confirmation of the declaration which we saw from Aberdeenshire East, Douglas Henderson holding off the challenge of Keith Raffin, a prominent young
The
Conservative.
Conservatives did recover just a little, about a 1% improvement in their position compared to SNP in February.
He's quite a showman, Mr. Raffin. He was fighting in London in the last election. And here are three London results, well, in and around and not too far away. Stewart and Hitchin, and of course there's Banbury and Esher.
Very low swings.
And now we're going a little further afield into some fairly safe seats up in the Midlands.
Very low swing for the mining seat in Bolsover.
And now here's Ian Gilmer, who's the head of the Conservative Research Department and one of the thinkers of the revision of Conservative policy.
3% switch from Liberal to Labour.
Angus Maude, a familiar figure. He quarrelled with Mr. Heath, of course, in bygone days. Some people have thought it surprising that he was not given office during the Heath government.
2% switch from Liberal to Labour.
And in safe Bournemouth East, Mr. John Caudle returns with a 5-figure majority.
4% switch from Liberal to Labour.
Let's go up to the northwest coast, another very safe Conservative seat.
Labour just push up into second place.
And here's Devon West, an outside Liberal hope had there been any kind of a push their way.
But Mr. Mills increases his majority by about 700.
Conservatives have held Ripon. That was one of the seats which they lost to the Liberals in the by-elections during the Heath government, and they won it back, of course, in February. They've now held it this time. And I think dominating the Houses of Parliament, as is his right and wont, Robert Mackenzie.
Well, if I can do my King Kong act and take the roof off Parliament, we can have a look at how it's shaping up inside. Now, so far, the Labour Party has just over 300. We're assuming 250 already in. We haven't room to show all the seats in the House, but assuming Labour with, at present, 306, and headed certainly, by all the estimates we've been able to get from computer and so on, for the magic number 318 and just over. That ensures that they will have an overall majority of at least 135, something of that kind, in the new House. So we see something like that as the position as far as the prediction is concerned. The Tories at the present time have 235, but the computer is saying they're going to end up with about 276, give or take 1 or so. The others, the third parties and fourth parties, at present have 19, but the prediction is they'll have 39. Now, the Tories, therefore, cannot get to the 318 magic figure, and it is interesting that if you put the third parties with the Tories and give them a few more seats to get up to this area, we then go to have a situation in which Labour is around 320, all others around 318, 317, with a 135 majority for Labour. That's the way it looks. And incidentally, the fact that we haven't put all the seats in here, remember, there isn't room for all the MPs to sit down in the House of Commons. Only about 2/3 can sit down on benches at any given time. That's going to be the way it looks, though, with, on Mr. Speaker's right, a government with a bare overall majority, and on Mr. Speaker's left, something like that kind of near position between the two sides of the House. Alistair.
It doesn't look like King Kong at all. Let's have some more results, this time from the southwest. And there's
Falmouth and Camborne, that really is a remarkable result, a swing to the Conservatives of 1.8. We've had only about 6 seats swinging to the Conservatives at all, and none swinging by more than 0.6. Falmouth and Camborne defies the national pattern again.
Well, Mr. David Mudd is a bit of a personality down in that part of the world, and he's a very lively member. Mr. James Spicer in Dorset West, and Mr. John Knott, who was a junior Treasury Minister in the Heath government, all doing pretty well. And now here's Eldon Griffiths in Bury St Edmunds, Norfolk Southwest, and Mr. Anthony Fell, a pronounced anti-European, back in Yarmouth.
Slightly low swings there. The East Anglian swing is, I think, almost the lowest of any region.
And while we wait for more results to come through, David, now you can knock off Caithness and Sutherland from your list, and I'm just getting news of a recount in Kinross and West Perthshire. This was Sir Alec Douglas-Hume's old seat. It's being defended by the Conservatives, by Mr. Nicholas Fairbairn, an Edinburgh lawyer, and this is one where the Scottish National Party certainly had its fingers crossed. It's taken Perth and East Perthshire, Ian MacArthur's seat, and here Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, who retired from the House of Commons after many years' service, beginning down there in Lanark, but latterly, when he gave up his peerage and returned to the House for Kinross and West Perthshire. And now, on his departure, Conservatives in trouble there.
It's one of the two gains. The SNP must still be hoping for that, and Ross and Clomity, which you're still to hear from a good deal later today.
Well, bad news for the Conservatives from the Braes of Athol, who would have supposed that just a few years ago. Of course, in Kinross and West Perth, there's been quite a little bit of television campaigning. You remember Dr. Cameron from Dr. Finlay's casebook? Well, Andrew Cruikshank, that's who he is. He went back to Callander, which was Tanach Bray in the serial, and he canvassed there and campaigned for the Scottish Nationalist. Dr. Finlay himself, as you might expect from the character, he made a party political broadcast for the Conservative Party in Scotland. Well, now I think we have an opportunity to hear our first possibility of a result from Northern Ireland. And in Belfast South, this is the middle-class part of Belfast. Diane, Karen, I think are we near to a result
And
there?
now it's literally only a matter of seconds before the result will be known. At last there's a bit of excitement at the City Hall. It's been very quiet all morning. Very few supporters have been in. But now, unbelievably, some have managed to get past the very strict security, and they're here, they're pushing in. This is the first result at the City Hall, and they're really agog now. Mr. Roy Kerr is the Deputy Returning Officer, and he's about to make the first announcement.
You have a large number of candidates there, don't you, Diane? Our feeling is that it's likely that the combined United Ulster Unionist will hold this seat. That's the Reverend Robert Bradford. But we, of course, wait for the actual figures now.
He's fighting a former member, Mr. McMaster.
But, of course, Mr. McMaster is rather damaged, David, by the fact that he also has some other power-sharing people in there. The Alliance Party, the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and the SDLP are all in there fighting each other.
Constituency. I, the undersigned, being the Deputy Returning Officer for the constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Bradford, Robert John, 30,160.
That was the United Unionist candidate.
Carracher, Benjamin, 2,390. Glass,
Alliance.
Basil, 11,715. Holmes, Erskine,
Northern Ireland Labour.
1,643. McMaster, Stanley,
Independent Unionist.
4,982. And that the undimensioned person has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency, Robert John Bradford.
Mr. Kerr, Deputy Returning Officer, Mr. McCormick, Officer...
Well, now, Mr. Robert Bradford, the Reverend Robert Bradford, is a Methodist minister. He has had a stunning success there. He has really wiped out all his opponents. One should make clear that this is the Reverend Robert Bradford, not Mr. Roy Bradford, who was a former minister in Mr. Faulkner's government, who has now leaned very much more towards the United Ulster Unionist coalition. But on the strength of that vote, David, it would look as if the three U's are not going to have any difficulty in holding their seats around Belfast and in the strong Protestant areas.
No, I'm sure it means that we are still waiting for the confirmation that Joe Fitt is back in West Belfast, which most people expect, and for what happens in Mid-Ulster and for Mayo and South Tyrone, which are the two most likely seats to change. We also want to see how big Enoch Powell's majority is in South Tyrone.
One of the points, I think, in that very big majority for the Reverend Robert Bradford is that it does suggest what an early election, even under proportional representation, would do in Northern Ireland, were one to be called in order to give a justification to, say, a convention, a constitutional convention there. It would suggest, to my mind, that all these parties, the Alliance, the Faulkner Unionists, and the Northern Ireland Labour Party, would be in very serious trouble indeed.
But the interesting thing is that the Alliance Party was chosen as the vehicle for the power sharers.
Well, now, Murray and Nairn has been held by Mrs. Winifred Ewing against a Conservative counterattack, That was one that caused such an upset last time. It was the first indication that the Scottish Nationalists were going to do pretty well there. And Mrs. Ewing, one of the colourful figures in the House of Commons, standard bearer for the Scottish Nationalists since she won the Hamilton by-election back in the 60s, and she is very safely back, I think, in Murray and Nairn. Let's just see if we got some more results while we're waiting. Keith Hampson in Ripon, and two other results, the Labour majority in Goole and Leon Britton in Cleveland and Whitby.
A very comfortable majority in Ripon. It's now a safe Conservative seat again, I think, after the aberration, as they must see it there, of the by-election.
And to that extent, a Liberal reverse. And here's the prediction, as we just come up to 1 o'clock, that Labour still has an overall majority. Labour 320 seats, Conservative 276, Liberal 12, others 27. Overall majority, 5 seats. Well, that was just a little bit of interest there from up north, and news that Saffron Walden, that used to be Rab Butler's seat, has been held by Mr. Peter Kirk, who led the Conservative delegation to the Strasbourg Parliament. And we also are awaiting results from Doncaster. It used to be a Conservative seat. I imagine it will stay Labour. But here's a chance now to talk this morning. Well, just now this afternoon. Sue.
Well, let's take a look at the state of the parties in London and the South East as we come up to 1 o'clock now. In London, 51 Labour seats, 40 Conservatives. That, of course, includes the one Labour gain from Conservatives. In the home counties, 13 Labour seats, 47 Conservative seats. That, of course, includes the 4 Labour gains from the Conservatives there. And looking at that now on our GLC map, first of all, and the amazing thing about this is that it looks practically exactly the same as it did when I first showed it to you at 11 o'clock last night, before any results were in. If you've got black and white sets, the dark area around here, the red, if you've got colour, is the Labour stronghold, the outer circle, the patchwork of blue and red together. Only one result missing now, which is Kensington there in pale grey, which of course is Sir Brandon Rhys-Williams, who was in last time with a comfortable majority of 5,532, so I shouldn't think he's very worried. The only change we've had to make on this map all night is this one Labour gain of Ilford North, where Millie Miller took that seat from Tom Ironmonger. And that's reflected here on our battleground board. Ilford North, there it is, but we were never actually able to move the swinger here because, of course, Barney Hayhoe hung on to Brentford Isleworth by the skin of his teeth, reduced majority there, and John Loveridge held on to Upminster, again with the reduced majority. So the swing to Labour was in fact reflected, funnily enough, in the South East, in the home counties themselves, which is traditionally Conservative stronghold. Of course, Oxford, Rochester and Chatham, Hemel Hempstead, that's Monty Woodhouse, Peggy Fenner, James Allison, all out there. We were in the early hours of this morning, able to move our swingometer to there. And then, of course, Welland and Hatfield went. Lord Balneil was defeated by Helene Middleweek, 25-year-old girl there. And, of course, Braintree is still to come. We're expecting this result any time within the next hour. Anthony Newton there defending that seat against Keith Kyle. In many ways, the swinger belongs right in the middle there. They might have a chance of taking it, not a great chance. They have a larger majority there, the Conservatives, than they had in Welland and Hatfield. And, of course, the Liberals. Well, it's been a pretty sorry night all round as far as the Liberals are concerned. They failed to get any of these Liberal hopes. You see, we've got them marked with blue ticks here, which means that the Conservatives held all the seats that the Liberals hoped to gain from them. Newbury, in fact, was one of the easiest seats in the country for the Liberals to gain, and they failed. And their vote is down everywhere. They will have lost 16 deposits, I think, by the time all the results are in London and the South East. Lost 16 deposits, and quite a few of those second places that they picked up last time. As far as the National Front is concerned, they haven't saved any of their deposits in the area so far. They've lost 46 of them, and there's just one more result we're waiting on now. Among the Conservative MPs safely returned this morning, John Gorst, one of the earliest lobbyists for commercial radio in Britain, has held Hendon North. Michael Heseltine, Conservative spokesman on trade, is back in Henley. Margaret Thatcher, who's been mentioned in some of the papers today as a possible successor to Mr Heath, has been returned to Finchley with a considerably reduced majority. Sir Derek Walker-Smith, the well-known anti-marketeer, is back in Hertfordshire East, and Nicholas Scott, a Minister for Employment in Mr Heath's last government, who lost his seat to Arthur Latham, of course, in Paddington in the February election with a boundary change there, is now going back to Westminster from the rather safer constituency of Chelsea, which is, of course, Sir Marcus Worsley's old seat. And now back to you, Alistair.
Well, now, sir, I'm interested in two things that you said there. One is the result we're waiting for from Braintree. It would be a very remarkable result for Keith Kyle if he can win this one, because he's been ill pretty well throughout the campaign. He's been in hospital, and so he hasn't been able to give the personal touch in that election. You also said that we're waiting for Kensington. I think there's been trouble about some of the ballot papers there. I'd just like to assure you that I cast my vote perfectly correctly in Kensington yesterday morning, and if they're going to declare it a foul, I'm going to take personal exception to it.
Well, I wish they'd hurry up, because I'd like to have my map completed. It's the one hole that's left on it, Alistair.
If I'm making these personal declarations, I cast my vote quite illegally in Oxford, because I voted in person when I got a postal vote, and it wasn't legal, and they let me do it. I only discovered afterwards I'd broken the law.
They're coming to carry you away. And Labour, with 308 seats now, have a net gain of 18. Conservatives with 244, a net loss of 20. Liberals with 9 seats so far, a net loss of 1. And there are 12 others. This building up the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, and now results coming in from the Loyalists in Northern Ireland. News that Hereford has remained with the Conservative. That's one that the Liberals might have had some hopes for, but the Conservatives there, Colin Shepherd, has held that seat. Now let's go to Belfast West for the declaration in Jerry Fitt's seat.
West Belfast constituency. I, the undersigned, being the Deputy Returning Officer for the constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Gerard Fitt,
SDLP,
21,821. Samuel McKee Gibson,
Volunteer Political Party,
2,690. Peter Donald Patrick Kerins,
Communist Marxist Leninist,
203. John McQuaid,
United Unionist,
16,265. Kitty O'Kane,
Republican Clubs,
3,547. And that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency, Gerard Fitt.
Yeah!
Jerry Fitt, who was Deputy Prime Minister in the power-sharing government with Brian Faulkner. He is the stalwart, of course, of the Roman Catholic population in West Belfast. Standing beside him, Mr. John McQuaid, who is equally the stalwart of the Protestant population in the Shankill Road.
He gets 49% of the vote, up 8% on his performance last February.
For the very efficient and, from my point of view, the very satisfactory way in which this count has been conducted. This has been the 4th occasion in which I have fought West Belfast. And once again, I have been returned at the top of the poll. I take this as a personal compliment to me by the electors in that constituency, and to the thousands and thousands of people who braved many obstacles throughout all these campaigns to ensure that I would be their voice at Westminster. I can only pledge once again that I will do in the future as I have done in the past, and act in the interest of everyone. And if someone wants to fight me again in another election, I'll only be too pleased to meet them halfway.
Well, that is indeed a personal compliment, I think, to Jerry Fitt. He has done well in that seat, but of course one has to expect in Belfast West that the division will be very largely indeed along sectarian lines. The interesting point there for me was how the Republican Clubs candidate, and Republican Clubs are popularly identified with Sinn Féin, they got 3,547 votes there. Now, of course, that may not seem very much, but it does show how an active minority exists in West Belfast. I think this is an opportunity to go up while we are waiting for that second recount at Beeston. That's one that could just tip over between Labour and Conservative, that we're waiting for a chance to get out and about again and go up to Murray and Nairn, just up there on the Murray Firth. And here's Mrs. Winnie Ewing's result, and my goodness, she had quite a fight.
She dropped 8% of the vote. I think this is mainly due to a Liberal intervention. The Liberals didn't fight last time. They got 9% of the vote.
And here's Winnie Ewing, of course, when she broke into politics by capturing Hamilton at a famous by-election during the 1966 Wilson government. She became the firm favourite of the Scottish National Party. Then she unseated the then Conservative Secretary of State for Scotland, Mr. Gordon Campbell, in Murray and Nairn, and she's held on now. Well, now here's how the Scottish National Party has been doing, capturing Angus South. It's held its own seat of Dundee East, also in Banff, Hamish Watt. A capture again from the Conservatives in Perth and East Perthshire, another from the Conservatives in Galloway, and yet another in Dumbartonshire East. Aberdeenshire East, that's Douglas Henderson's seat, we saw the declaration a short while ago, was SNP after February, and so Winnie Ewing's in Murray and Nairn.
Well, it's fascinating, the nip and tuck race between the Liberals and the SNP to be the fourth party in Parliament. There are 8 seats. If they hold the 2 that are still to come, that they did hold last time, Western Isles and Stirling East and Clackmannan, that puts them up to 10. If they win Kinross, where we know there's a recount, and if they were to win Ross and Cromarty, that would put them up to 12 seats. I think that's probably their ceiling. The Liberals are hovering. They're waiting for the result from Berwick and, of course, from Orkney and Shetland and Inverness and Roxburgh, and they probably will end up, I think, with 13 seats. So
well,
it's
now
very close.
I think Bill Miller is in our Glasgow studio. Good afternoon, Bill. What's your view on the SNP's performance?
Very much the same as David Butler's. They, I think, will retain Argyll. If they retain Murray, it should be fairly easy to retain Argyll. On the swings that we've seen in the seats where they're challenging the Conservatives, then they should certainly take Ross and Cromarty by a majority of about 700 or 800 votes. Kinross is a great surprise, but one of those surprises that everybody expected. We knew that Sir Alec was retiring. We knew that the new Conservative candidate was not entirely to the liking of some of the people in the locality. We didn't know to how many people in the locality, so it was one of the surprises we were looking out for. That may be a 50-50, so I would say 12 or 13 SNP seats. And all of these gains have been made at the expense of the Conservatives.
I just interrupt you for one moment there, Bill, to say that Braintree has been held by the Conservatives. As one was saying a short while ago, in fact, it would have been a very remarkable success for the Labour candidate Keith Kyle, because he has been ill during this campaign. Let's have some further results. John Caudle in Bournemouth. Lewis, Dorset North, David James in Dorset North. He often goes off hunting the Loch Ness Monster, but he'll be able to do that now. His majority looks quite comfortable.
Liberals have just held on to second place in all those 3 seats, but their vote is down in each of them.
And some 2 Conservatives there and a Labour up there in Yorkshire.
Liberals in second place in the first 2 and have held on to their position. In fact, slightly increased their vote in Howden.
Here's Mr. Biffin in Oswestry. Perhaps in economic terms, financial terms, he is closest to Mr. Enoch Powell's views on how to run the economy inside the Conservative Party.
Labour push up into second place in Oswestry, Liberals second in Shrewsbury and Worcestershire South.
Now, Robin has got some politicians and also a leading trade unionist with him, Sir Geoffrey Howe from the Conservative Shadow Cabinet, Mr. Reg Prentice, the Secretary of State for Education, and Mr. Hugh Scanlon of the Engineering Union. Robin.
Well, Sir Geoffrey Howe and Mr. Reginald Prentice have slightly increased their respective majorities in their constituencies. Mr. Scanlon doesn't fight elections. He is in his elected office for life, and so handles things rather better than they do. May I just ask you first, Sir Geoffrey Howe, in a situation where Labour looks like having a majority of only 5 or so over all other parties, what effect, in your view, is this likely to have on the policies of the government? Is the influence of the moderates like Mr. Prentice going to increase, or is the influence of the Marxists, such as Mr. Scanlon, likely to increase?
Well, it's a curious question to put to me, if I may say so.
Well, I thought it was one you would rather enjoy answering.
Well, indeed. I welcome the opportunity. I sit between the 2 of them. I think that the consequences for the government now will be a very severe pressure as between trying to pursue policies which are responsible and in the interests of the nation, putting priority on tackling inflation, trying, in other words, to put into the social contract what is missing from it, some policy for wage restraint to prevent wage inflation overtaking the country, which Reg Prentice has often talked about, and the stretch on the other side from Hugh Scanlon and people who think like him, placing emphasis on the Marxist parts of the social contract. And I think this is going to produce very real tensions for the government.
But you haven't really answered the question. Perhaps you can't. But do you think that, in fact, this situation... I just got to go to a declaration, and we'll come back to this fascinating point in a moment.
I declare that Thomas Russell Fairgrieve has been duly elected to serve as Member of Parliament for the constituency. The voting for the candidates was as follows. Charles William Ellis, Labour, 5,185. Thomas Russell Fairgrieve, 15,111. David Campbell Patterson Gracie, Liberal, 12,643. Nicol Sutter, 9,409.
SNP.
Russell Fairgrieve is a former president of the Scottish Tories. He went up to Aberdeenshire almost at the last minute back in February to fight the seat which Colin Mitchell, Mad Mitch as he was called, held from Laura Grimmond in 1970. Mr. Fairgrieve had fought David Steele down in the Borders before then, very well-known Border family, and this is a considerable personal success for him, showing how the Conservatives can fight back against Liberal and SNP challenges.
This was the only hope of a Liberal gain in Scotland, or indeed in the remaining results. They haven't gained it. This SNP vote increased.
And now straight back to you, Robin.
Sir Geoffrey, if we may continue, do you think that in this situation, having regard to what you've said, that the position of the so-called moderates, or as Mr. Prentice would say, the right wing of the Labour Party and the Labour cabinet, would be increased, their influence would be increased in this situation?
Well, I'm not sure what the actual result will be. I think the result of the election, the narrowness of Labour's majority, is a clear indication of the wishes of the people, that Labour should not follow the left-wing socialist Marxist policies which are advocated in that wing of the party.
Mr. Prentice, what do you say about this? Do you think the position of moderates such as yourself is now strengthened?
Well, I think that the fact that we're likely to have a small majority is not in itself going to inhibit us from carrying out any of our programme. There are plenty of historical precedents for that. A government with a small majority can still govern.
And a minority government.
A minority government can govern. But with a majority, you can get your legislation through. Life is difficult, but you can do it, and we shall do it. As to whether we're a moderate government or not, I think the facts of our national situation mean that the government has got to make the widest possible appeal to the bulk of the British people. And I'd be saying that if we were facing a prospect of a majority of 100, just as I do at this moment.
But do you think that a majority of 5, as opposed to a majority of 100, makes the position of people who hold roughly your kind of social democratic moderate views more strong than it would otherwise be?
I don't know. I hope so, because I always fight for my point of view. And I wanted to see a Labour government. I want to see social democratic views prevail within that government. I think they will.
Mr. Scanlon, how do you view the prospect of a Labour government obviously being under parliamentary pressure and perhaps from public opinion to moderate its programme of socialist change, because it has only got a majority of about 5, and as many people have pointed out during this programme, nearly 60% of the vote cast not in favour of socialism?
Well, may I just get my little quip back? For one who's contested or defended elections over the last 25 years in order to retain my position, I like your little quib about being elected for life.
I was only making a joke.
Yes,
Mr. Scanlon, because we have a rather long day and a smile is often quite welcome. And to see you smile like that is worth the remark.
Well, I'm glad you made it then.
Now, let's get back to the serious stuff.
Strangely enough, I go along with Reg Prentice, that the programme of the Labour Party was determined in 1973. I hope it will be confirmed when we recall it in 1974. And I, for one, certainly hope that the trade union movement in general will support that programme.
Do you think that the British people have given, by this election, have given their full-hearted consent to a programme of nationalisation and state control, for instance?
I don't think the British people ever give their full-hearted consent to any particular issue. That's what democracy is all about. It's the contentions between various groupings, and the grouping that gets the largest of any of the other groupings, other than those other groupings I mean, the one that gets the largest vote, albeit not a majority, is the one that's got the responsibility of giving effect to its programme.
So you say press on with socialist measures and don't bother about the small majority?
I say press on with the programme as determined by the party, and so long as the Labour Party does that, it will receive the wholehearted support of the trade unions.
And no moderation in the interests of what is called national unity?
The conflicts between the various political parties are sharpening up to such an extent that I don't think that compromise, moderation as you call it, is a starter.
Mr. Prentice, do we want conflicts sharpening up now at a time of very great national crisis?
I think where there's a clear public issue, whether or not we should have a wealth tax, whether or not we should bring development land under public ownership, we don't want to fudge the difference. We have a distinctive policy on that. We shall carry that through, I'm sure. I, on the other hand, wouldn't want to stir up any extra conflict, any unnecessary conflict.
By what, for instance?
Well, I think that one very important question is how far the social contract is going to work out.
Yes.
I want to see it work out in practice, and I want to see it accepted by the community as a whole. I think that the emphasis has been far too much on whether or not trade unionists will respond. I think they have part of the responsibility, but equally, if we're talking about incomes restraint, we should be talking about salesmen's commissions, professional fees, high salaries, the lot. In other words, one wants to see a community in which all groups are working for the good of the country and the good of the community. Otherwise, whatever government had won this election, we're not going to get through the next few years successfully.
Sir Geoffrey Howe.
Well, in fact, you see, one sees the problem immediately becoming clear. That Hugh Scanlon would have the Labour government press ahead with policies that are divisive, that are not likely to be the foundation for the success of the social contract, policies that are actually going to be harmful. Nationalisation clearly will do no good in these circumstances. Other features like the extension of trade union rights and pickets' rights, the repeal of the compromise provisions in the last Labour government's Trade Union and Labour Relations Act, are beside the point of our present problem. Yet Reg Prentice would recognise that, I think, will find himself under pressure from Mr. Scanlon to do things that will be actually harmful.
Of course, perhaps these two gentlemen might say, and if they say it, I'd better shut up, but they might say that you, as the architect of the Industrial Relations Act, are hardly anyone to give advice on how to deal with industrial relations or the solving of the problem.
I've no doubt they would say that, but I would...
And if they were to say that, what would you say?
Well, what I would say is that the legislation which passed through the last Parliament contained only 2 or 3 modifications of what the last Labour government suggested.
Can I come to Hugh Scanlon, without going back over the Industrial Relations Act, a practical point now. We've had a number of businessmen this morning saying industry's cash problem, sliding into bankruptcy. Sir Don Ryder said, we've got to have immediate action by government, including the easing of price controls. Now, if the price controls are eased, what happens to the chances of moderating wage claims or trade unionists taking a reasonable attitude to their wage demands?
Yes. May I don't want to evade that, but I noticed that Sir Geoffrey, in any of his condemnation, didn't mention at all what the attitude of employers will be during this accepted crisis, economic difficulties. As of now, we have had no single statement from any representative body of employers as to what their attitude will be if the trade union movement limits its claims to those increases which occur as a result of cost of living increases.
Well, isn't that an argument for having the employers in on as parties to the social contract? Made it a tripartite social contract instead of a bipartite.
One of our criticisms as a union against it was precisely that.
You said so. You said that's why it's not really a contract.
I have indeed.
In your September journal.
And you're not going now to take me on to the argument. Let me make it perfectly clear. We're happy that there's a Labour government back. We hope the first thing that it will do will continue with the path of setting right the disruption which Sir Geoffrey's bill caused in industry. And those things are the Lord's Amendment, which I've said was provocative and divisive, and we hope furthermore that this question of easing of prices, which was your question, and maybe I part company now with both, Red Young with Sir Geoff. Britain's economic ills, and I've said this till I'm fed up, depend upon increasing the efficiency of British industry, not in either controlling wages or in increasing prices.
Are you in favour of...
lacking investment,
I've got to leave you now because Mr. and Mrs. Harold Wilson, if you excuse me, Geoffrey, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Wilson are coming to their car, and perhaps Keith Graves has got a microphone with him.
The Prime Minister's just told us that he's going to Downing Street for some lunch with Mrs. Wilson, and he hopes to make a statement back here at 3 o'clock. He's obviously still watching those late results coming in. He's just been talking about half an hour with Ron Haywood, the Secretary of the Labour Party. They've been studying the results. They've also studied the ones that have still to come in, and obviously he's not going to say anything until those last few results are in.
So Mr. Wilson goes on his way to 10 Downing Street. And there are still some results to come in. So far, nothing very much for his comfort. Kensington has been held by the Conservatives. And just before we take any more results, to be wholly fair to Mr. Scanlon, he is doing two jobs at the moment. He's both President and Temporary General Secretary of his engineering union, and an election to relieve him of the General Secretary's job is going to take place now. In fact, the ballot papers have gone out to 800,000 members. The fight really is between, we think, Bob Wright, a militant, and Mr. John Boyd, a moderate. The result of that will be in several weeks' time, but if neither of them has an overall majority, there are many other candidates, there'll be another ballot in March. So Mr. Scanlon is very much in the election industry. I think we'll have a look at some of the results from Belfast. Here's William Craig, one of the leaders of the United Ulster Unionist Coalition, back against Mr. Faulkner's follower, Mr. Peter McLaughlin.
11% jump in his share of the vote.
And of course, he would have made it even had Mr. David Blakely not stood for Northern Ireland Labour. Here's Mr. Craig now talking.
All of the electorate. I'm very grateful to the wonderful team of workers who rallied round me. It was a great, big, happy family, and I think we enjoyed the campaign enormously. I would also like to say a thank you to my two opponents and their workers who helped to make this campaign a relaxed exercise in democracy. And I do hope that the result that has been so resoundingly declared in East Belfast will be recognised in the United Kingdom Parliament as the authentic voice of Ulster.
And standing beside Mr. Craig was Mr. Blakely and Mr. McLaughlin. Mr. Craig, a former Home Affairs Minister in Northern Ireland, his break with Captain Terence O'Neill back in the 60s was perhaps the beginning of that split in the Ulster Unionist Party. North Down has been held by the United Ulster Unionist Coalition, but we'll have the result from Belfast North. Mr. John Carson holding that seat.
19% jump in the Ulster Unionist vote there.
These are very big majorities and show how Northern Ireland has swung against power sharing, certainly in large parts of the Protestant community. While Robin's discussion was going on, we did, of course, see Shirley Williams being returned. Here's Mr. Wilson coming up to his own front door, his office front door now, at number 10 Downing Street. There's a little cheer for him. This is a time when people go to Downing Street to see the victor, sometimes to see the vanquished, and sometimes to see the victor going off to visit Buckingham Palace. Mr. Wilson, perhaps he'll have a word for us, perhaps he'll pause on the doorstep for northern photographers. Who knows? He's having a busy day since he returned from Liverpool. And I think we are getting, as Mr. Wilson goes into the door of number 10 with Mrs. Wilson, we expect a result just imminent now from North Antrim. That's the Reverend Ian Paisley's seat.
Ian Paisley has had.
I, the undersigned, being the Deputy Returning Officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. McAllister Mary, 7,616. Paisley Ian Richard Kyle,
Democratic Unionist,
43,186. Wilson Hugh,
Alliance,
8,689. And that the above undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency. Paisley Ian Richard Kyle.
So there is Ian Paisley back, and of course one of the best known figures in Northern Ireland, one of the strongest advocates of continuing of Protestant government there.
9% jump in his share of the poll.
Deputy Returning Officer, Mr. Assistant Returning Officer, fellow candidates, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to propose a very sincere and hearty vote of thanks to the Deputy Returning Officer, to the Assistant Returning Officer, better known to us as the Town Clerk, and to the workers here today for a magnificent job done, and for a job done in good and record time. It must be a long, hard slog for each worker, handling the ballot papers, smoothing them out, sorting them out, and then counting them. And I would like to say on behalf of all those who have worked in this election, a very hearty and sincere word of thanks. I'd like to thank my election agent, the Reverend James Baggs, who is, of course, the greatest election agent in the world as far as I'm concerned. Because the first time I entered the battle in North Antrim, we had a majority of 2,500. The last election, we had a majority of 27,000. And this election, we have a majority of 34,500. And that, I think, is a record, and maybe will be the biggest majority in the whole of the United Kingdom. So I'd like to return my thanks to my election agent and to those people who have worked so hard and well for me during this election. And also to all the voters who cast their vote in my favour yesterday on a decrease of the poll to increase my majority and increase my total vote is very significant indeed. And I deeply and really appreciate it. And then to the best wee woman in the world who has stood by me in all my battles, I would say a very warm word of thank you. I'm going to give her a kiss. I'm not going to refight the election from this platform. All I'm going to say is this, that I happen to be a Democrat. I believe in the verdict of the ballot box. The people of North Antrim have spoken. They have spoken loud and clearly. And I will go back to Westminster with your mandate to see to it that this part of Ulster gets its fair share and also that Ulster remains firmly within the United Kingdom, and that we re-establish democratic institutions in this land in keeping with our British heritage and our British constitutional rights. The answer from North Antrim is no to a united Ireland and no surrender to all Ulster's enemies. Thank you.
Very self-confident Mr. Paisley. Mr. Paisley will, of course, be returning to Westminster with Mr. Enoch Powell, whom we expect to see return from Southdown. And some people have said it would be interesting to see how those two manage to work in harness. But there was nothing in what Mr. Paisley said then, in the programme that he laid down, that would conflict with what Mr. Enoch Powell has been saying. Chance of one result, I think, here now from Wales. This is Barry, Sir Raymond Gower, one of the stalwarts of the Conservative Party in Wales through thick and thin.
The fact that there's only a 2.2% swing there, I think, takes Monmouth, which was the third outside possibility of a Labour gain still to come, out of the possible.
And the news, I don't know whether it's sunshine or showers, but for the Conservatives it's sunshine in Beeston, as you saw there. After two recounts, this was one which might have tipped over the Labour way, so that James Lester has held that seat for the Conservatives. A look at the state of the parties. Labour, with 314 seats now, having made 18 net gains. Conservatives, with 265 seats, having had 20 net losses. Liberals, with 9 seats at the moment, a net loss of 1, and there are so far returned 17 others, with Northern Ireland results beginning to come in and some still awaited from Scotland. And now, Bob, in the middle of the battleground, that news from Beeston, how does that affect things?
Well, let's just remind ourselves, it's about 15 hours since we began talking about the battleground, and it's falling silent now pretty well, except for one very important skirmish still to come. If you look at the Labour side, there was no swing to the Conservatives, therefore they've held all their marginal seats. We've only now to hear from Gloucestershire West, those most unlikely to go, granted the way against them, the way they've held all the others, and Brecon and Radnor, again, almost certainly to be held by Labour. So their whole battlefront remained intact. They broke through into Conservative territory, as we see here. The Conservatives holding out astonishingly, however, against the sweep down that line, and holding, again, seats down here. And this is the one we're most interested in now on this list. Woodrow Wyatt's old seat of Bosworth, which is the one now I think Labour could pick up, which would alter their majority. It would raise, if it passed to Labour, it would mean something like a 7-seat majority overall instead of 5. But again, you see Conservatives holding constituencies within that area. And then Labour did break through at Leicester South and Birmingham Selly Oak. These were sort of paratroop landings behind the Conservative lines. But the Conservatives, even at that level, absolutely consistently holding their position. It's, I think, worked out as a battleground in a rather interesting way. And the battle now, as I say, is almost over as far as the great marginal struggle is concerned here.
And David?
Well, actually, Bosworth makes a difference between a majority of 3 and a majority of 1 for Labour. It's the only issue at stake, whether Labour's clear majority is 3 or 1. I don't think there are any other seats due to come which could affect the outcome. As for Labour's clear majority, there are several other seats we're watching for. Will the Liberals hold Berwick against the Conservative challenge? Will the Scottish Nationalists get Kinross and Ross and Cromarty from the Conservatives? And what is going to happen in Mid-Ulster and Fermanagh and South Tyrone? Those are what we're waiting for, with only 32 seats, 31 seats still to come.
I think we must say that some of the counting has been appreciably quicker this time. I notice Mr. Paisley saying that in North Antrim.
Oh, I think, well, the turnout was smaller, and therefore the counting could be quicker.
But even in the old days, I think, David, sometimes one didn't expect some of these seats until well on into the afternoon.
No, I think that is true. The late seats, the mining seats, sometimes we used to wait till 4 or 5 o'clock for safe mining seats in Yorkshire. I think actually there are 1 or 2 still to come of that sort.
Tiverton, which was a very, very dicey one, the Liberals might just have picked it up if they'd had a very strong swing going their way, but Mr. Robin Maxwell Hislop has now held it. Well, with this news, I think there's an opportunity now. Robin is talking to Jack, the cartoonist.
And Jack of the Evening Standard. Now, can you show us the cartoon which you have in the first edition of the Evening Standard, Jack?
Can I do it the other way around?
Oh, if you like.
Well, I did some alternatives. Last time I did them as boxers. This time I saw them as beauty contestants. And I thought, well, if Harold wins, we'd have him being chaired in the traditional Mecca way. And then, of course, another one I had to do was if Heath had won. And so we had him, exactly the same sort of position. And of course,
Can you just hold that? We'd like to have a good look at it so we can understand it.
There's no caption on this one.
No.
And
What would have been the caption?
Oh, well, there's no caption.
Oh, I see. But there is in the Evening Standard. It says, "We'll meet again with
Ah.
apologies to Vera Lynn."
Well, that one you have to sing, that caption.
Oh, I see.
And this was if there had been a draw.
I see.
Am I getting through?
Well, you didn't need that one, did you? But why have you put... this is the one in the Evening Standard.
Oh, well, we had a bit of confusion at the office this morning. I wasn't there.
Well, this is number 5. This is published just before lunch. Why is this one in the Evening Standard now?
Well, we do have a little problem about from when you wish to change something, you know, machines have to stop and things have to be taken out and put back.
Oh,
the next edition, your 6th edition, will be have Harold in there, grinning triumphantly.
Thank you, Jack. I've got to leave you to Sterling for the decoration.
They have been doing, and to thank Mr. Alan Stewart and his organisers for all the work that they've done in organising the poll. And I now have to announce the result in the constituency of Clackmannan and East Stirlingshire.
Yes, sir.
For Thomas Notman Alexander Begg,
Conservative,
there were cast 5,369 votes. For Richard Giles Douglas,
Labour,
18,657. For George Newlands Reid,
SNP,
25,009. $25,998, and for David Cathro Shields,
Liberal,
1,268. And I hereby declare that George Newlands Reid is elected as the member for this constituency.
So George Reid has increased his majority quite handsomely and held East Stirling and Clackmannan.
And George Reid, who surprisingly won the seat from Dick Douglas, holding on to it this time.
Very comfortably, with over 50% of the vote, an increase of 7% compared to last time. Big drop in the Conservative vote, Labour vote stationary, Labour share stationary.
George Reid, very well known in television in Scotland.
Above all, I'd like to thank you, the people of Clackmannan and East Stirling. In February...
Well, that is another one for the Scottish nationalists. I think they would have been very worried indeed if they had lost it, but a personal success for Mr. Reid. And now I think we have a personal statement from Dr. Butler.
Well, a statement from Dr. Butler and, I think, Dr. Mackenzie, because we both of us misled the viewers. In fact, what happens at Bosworth will make the difference between a Labour majority of 3 and a Labour majority of 5. I said 1 and he said 7. I mean, I think we split the difference.
At this stage of the game, little mental arithmetic problems may develop.
Well, I'm glad we've had that personal statement, and we've cleared that up, I believe, and let us continue. I hope it helps the Prime Minister in his dispositions. So we've had a little word with the cartoonist. We've been up to Scotland. We've clarified what we are waiting for now. And, of course, as David was saying, we are also waiting for these results from Northern Ireland, which could have quite an interesting balance on the political life of that province if, indeed, 2 seats, as are expected, may be lost by the Ulster Unionists there. With news that the burghers of East Grinstead have returned Mr. Geoffrey Johnson-Smith, another well-known television face on the Conservative side. Let's take some more results. Mr. Ronald Bell in Beaconsfield, Mr. Peter Kirk in Saffron Walden, and Mr. Stephen Hastings in Mid-Bedfordshire. Mr. Hastings on the right wing of the party, Mr. Kirk on the left.
Low swings and very little change in the votes in those 3 seats.
And here we have some more safe Conservative seats that have come in today. In Abingdon, Mr. Airy Neve, interested in aerospace and technology, and of course an escaper, Hertfordshire South West, Windsor and Maidenhead.
Labour second in all those 3 seats.
Keith Stainton in Sudbury and Woodbridge, Sir Howard Harrison in Eye, and Sir David Renton in Huntingdonshire. Sir David been in the House of Commons since 1945.
Labour again second place in Sudbury and in Huntingdon. Liberals still second in Eye.
And here we have some more safe Conservative seats: Gainsborough, Rutland and Stamford, Norfolk North.
Liberals still second in Gainsborough, Labour second in Rutland and Stamford and Norfolk North.
Well, that seems to be the results so far. The important one, which of course come in lately, is the Conservatives holding on in Beeston.
And Alistair, since people don't necessarily believe us pundits, let's say there are 315 seats for Labour there, 318 makes a clear majority. So let us watch for 3 more Labour returns, and there certainly are 3 more Labour returns in the pipeline over the next hour or so, I should think.
So that this is the time when the figures are meeting, and predictions which look so distant at the start of the night are now beginning to come true. But it is still only a very narrow Labour majority. Now, David, in terms of the narrow Labour majority, is there anything that you would like to say about forecasting in this election? We've said a lot about the polls. Did you really believe the opinion polls that were published just before the election
It was a
that
very
gave
odd
Labour such a
experience
huge...
that I spent a lot of the election travelling around and talking to agents, and on both sides, Conservative and Labour, I met people, many people who said, if it wasn't for the polls, I would say there was not much change in this election. I don't sense a great mood. I got very able Labour agents saying to me, I suppose we're in for a landslide, but I don't get it on the ground. And in this case, the agent's feel was right. And I met Conservatives who said, I suppose we're going to be clobbered, but I don't feel it. So I had this queasy feeling, and yet, in the end, the polls do talk more systematically. One can't actually spit in the face of the polls, or one always felt one couldn't spit in the face of the polls. Admittedly, after 3 elections, where they really seriously misled everyone, outside observers, professional politicians, one obviously is going to be that much more sceptical, put in that many more reserve clauses next election.
Is it possible that the British people are becoming less truthful when they talk to the polls? That there was a time when they did actually state their intentions, but now they may be having a bit of fun?
Well, the polls had an incredibly accurate record over the first 7 elections that they did. It was only in 1970 that they began to go wrong. I think it's partly because people do change their minds more. I think partly their minds may even be changed by the polls. I certainly know of some people who did vote differently when they thought there was going to be a Labour landslide. They wanted to temper the overweening arrogance of elected persons, as one put it to me, and therefore always vote for the party they think is going to lose, just to reduce the size of the majority.
And now, let's go to Bob.
Well, let's look again at that SNP takeoff board we talked about last evening. Now, the position's really extremely interesting. We said the takeoff would come somewhere just above 30% of the vote for the SNP. In fact, they just got about 30%, likely to pick up 12 or 13 seats, we don't know yet, but well short, at least rather short, of the point where they could have been really formidable contenders. What they wanted, of course, was at least half the seats in Scotland. But the fascinating thing, they came much nearer taking off than the event the Liberals did. And, of course, when you come to see where they've made their gains, they have not been able to cut into Labour strength at all in Scotland. There were predictions they might do more damage to Labour than they would Conservatives. In fact, it happened the other way around. And where they have picked up seats, they were 4 from the Conservatives. Conservatives held Angus. There's a recount here in Kinross, and they are likely to end up with 4 net gains from the Conservatives on present form. And, of course, so far they've held the 5 of their seats, 7 they held before, 5 have been held now, and we expect they probably will take the other 2. That's the sort of picture, better by far than the Liberal performance in terms of actual seats, but still disappointing for them because they were so near and yet didn't get the real takeoff they must really have been hoping for.
But here is the state of the parties in Scotland after 64 declarations. Labour with 42, Conservative with 13, Scottish National Party with 9. We would expect the Liberals to get 1, certainly, Mr. Joe Grimond. We'd expect them to get Mr. David Steele, Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles, and also Mr. Russell Johnston in Inverness, unless something curious has happened, so it doesn't look quite so bad for the Liberals
and they might
as
win
that
Berwick
would suggest.
Too. They might hold Berwick too.
Well, it would be nice if Berwick actually were in Scotland, David. Some of us think it should be, but I fear the SNP haven't fought it this time. Let's have a look at the state of the parties in Wales. And here is, of course, the great Labour strength. 21 Labour seats, Conservative 7, Liberal 2, and Plaid Cymru 3, and Plaid Cymru probably peaking there.
And the Liberals have just been disappointed in Denbigh, their one possibility of a gain in Wales. Here's the Denbigh result, and the Liberals didn't drop their vote much. They're only 0.7. The Conservatives dropped quite a lot, and so the Liberals cut into the Conservative majority by 1,500, but the Conservatives are still comfortably home. Plaid Cymru just lost their deposit.
And we have news that Louth has been held by the Conservatives. You remember that Mr. Geoffrey Archer, the sitting Conservative in Louth, was unable to stand at this election, so that means a success for Mr. Michael Brotherton, a newspaper executive. Now, down in Bodmin is one of the Liberal losers of the day, Paul Tyler, and Robin will be speaking to him, and in the studio to Lord Chalfont.
Mr. Tyler.
Hello.
How are you?
Feeling a bit tired.
Yes. I noticed that your Liberal majority of 9 in February has been replaced by a Conservative majority exactly 75 times as large.
Well, it was rather small before, so it's still
9,
quite a small majority.
Yes. To what do you attribute that?
I think it's the two-way stretch. I think clearly right through the country the Liberals have been under enormous pressure to pull in one direction or the other, presumably because they think that one majority or the other would be helpful in this present economic situation.
Do you think that's an unreasonable view?
Of course I do, because I'm a Liberal and I believe that the two-party system has got us into a mess and it's going to find it incredibly difficult to get us out of this mess, especially when it's such a narrow division between the two as it apparently now is.
But bearing in mind the strong position the Liberals were for a leap forward, this is probably a bigger setback for you than at previous elections, in a sense, isn't it?
Well, I was fighting a majority of nearly 4,000 when I won in February, managed to convert that into a Liberal majority. I was pleased to do that, naturally. Of course, it is a reverse, and I'm enormously disappointed, and I'm sure Liberals will be. But we have kept the swing in Bodmin to about 0.5%.
Nonetheless, it's a great disappointment for the Liberals to hear Dr. David Butler saying that it's either you or the Scottish Nationalists will be the 4th party in the House of Commons.
Yes, but we're not the 4th party in the country. We're going to get something between 5 and 6 million votes, I would guess. Your experts will know better than I.
Do you think... Sorry?
I was just going to say, I take the view that the electorate is almost as important as the seats in Parliament.
Well, I'm sure the Liberals in Parliament will miss you because you've made quite a reputation, according to impartial critics, for able speaking on difficult matters such as housing and so forth. Thank you for joining us, but stay with us because I just want to ask you one more question. Do you think the one reason for the rather disappointing Liberal result was being the fact that Lord Chalfont was supporting the Liberal cause?
Oh, no, that's very unfair.
I know, that's why I said it, just to
yes,
just
and
to
I can see he's there too with you, so I certainly wouldn't say it in his presence. I hope that we may see him in the future and we may be working together in the future.
Indeed. Lord Chalfont, what do you say about that theory of mine?
I think it's an outrageous theory, but I would have expected nothing else of you, Robin.
But do you think that your resignation from the Labour Party is responsible for having reduced Labour's hopes of a majority to so small a figure as 5?
No, I don't think that my resignation from the Labour Party has made any difference to the electoral figures at all. It wasn't meant to, of course, to be serious about it for a moment. It was a personal decision, a decision of personal and political principle. I am disappointed with the result of the election only in the long term, because, as I think you know, I had hoped for a realignment of the politics of the radical left in this country, and I believed, when I left the Labour Party, that a great success by the Liberal Party in this election could have helped that forward.
But the fact is that the people who share your kind of view, Mr. Taverne, whom you supported, Mr. Mayhew, whom you supported, have gone down.
Yes.
And the prospects for a social democratic split away from the Labour Party and a realignment of moderates in the centre is not enhanced by this election, is it?
No, it's made remote. I think one must face that. The decision of the electorate at this election is quite clearly that they don't want, at the moment, such a realignment. I think there are a number of reasons for that. One, I would suggest, is the possible failure of courage and leadership amongst the moderates and social democrats in this country.
Who are you speaking of? Mr.
I'm not speaking of anybody personally.
Well, you must have somebody in mind if you use such strong language.
I may have somebody in mind, but it's a different thing to have them in mind and speak about them publicly.
Well, won't you think it would be clearer to the public to know what you're talking about?
It may well be, but it's perhaps not always appropriate to be quite so clear with the public when one is dealing with personalities. What I'm saying is that no leader of the moderates and social democrats in this country has emerged.
Do you think, on the other hand, that the cause you believe in, that of social democracy, could perhaps be strengthened within the Labour government, within the Labour Party in Parliament, by reason of the fact that there is a smaller majority than expected? Or do you think that the left will be in a stronger position?
No, I think your first proposition is the more valid one. I think one ought to say at first that I don't think we should have any doubt that the Labour Party has won this election. I think all the arguments about who has voted socialist and who's voted anti-socialist are irrelevant and invalid. The Labour Party has won the election according to our own electoral system, which is the one that we are lumbered with. And what I think now is that that party has the opportunity to solve some of our immediate problems. I think they should be given that opportunity. There should be responsible government and responsible opposition. I believe they can solve the problem, but this is their time of challenge, I think. They've won, or they appear to have won, an absolute majority, although a small one. And I think we must now wait to see what kind of policies they put in train. I hope that their policies will be those which are designed to solve our immediate problems, and in the long term, of course, we may still see the realignment on the radical left of British politics, which I want to see.
Paul Tyler, what do you have to add to that, having listened to Lord Chalfont?
Just one point. I think the most important issue that's going to arise in the next few months in the new Parliament will be whether or not we stay in the common market and whether or not we have a referendum on that issue. I haven't, of course, been through the results constituency by constituency, but I would suspect that there is still a substantial majority of members of Parliament in the new House of Commons who will want to stay in because they don't see any realistic prospect of coming out.
We did have Mr. John McIntosh, who was elected to Parliament at this election, saying that he couldn't visualise himself supporting a referendum. He didn't actually say he'd vote against a bill for one, but he gave it clear that he wouldn't. Made it clear to me, at any rate, that he wouldn't support one. Thank you, Mr. Tyler. I'm under instructions to go back to Alistair.
And the important news during those conversations was of the recount at Bosworth, Adam Butler's seat, and this is the one which could still, apparently, go Labour's way this afternoon. In Northern Ireland, we are continuing to get results coming through. And here's the state of the parties after 6 declarations, 5 for the United Ulster Unionist Coalition, 1 Gerry Fitz seat for the Social Democratic and Labour Party. And this seems an appropriate time to go to Belfast and Vincent Hanna.
And counting continues in Northern Ireland by day, as is customary here, and perhaps it's just as well because last night was filled with 2 more assassinations and a series of explosions and fires. The assassinations were carried out by yet another terrorist force which has emerged, the Protestant Action Force calling themselves. But meanwhile, the political representatives of the Protestant community, the United Ulster Unionist Council, have been sweeping the board. Best to look at this not so much as a struggle between political parties in Northern Ireland, but more as a referendum, a kind of political plebiscite. And looking at the 4 results from Belfast, which perhaps provide the greatest guide in this way, the vote has gone up by nearly 12% from last time. This is a massive turnout, hardly any drop in the poll, went up from 42% to 54% of the poll. And with me, as always, is Mr. W.D. Flax, our political correspondent. Billy, it seems now that we can say that the moderate loyalist element has virtually been eliminated in Belfast, as far as one can see.
Well, there's no denying the advance of the Loyalist coalition in North, South and East Belfast. There they have converted overall minority votes in the last election into real majority votes this time. So I suppose the lesson of that is that even if the parties in the former executive had been able to agree on a single candidate in each of these divisions, it wouldn't have made any difference to the eventual result. And it's quite clear that the hope of the Loyalist coalition now is that their popular vote will be nearer 60% than the just over 51% at the last election, because they have been open to the criticism that they had a vote of only 51% in 11 of the 12 seats, and this was really disproportionate.
Yes, and I found it significant too that wherever the SDLP look as if they're going to do well, as in West Belfast, that particular side of the community was polling heavily as well. It looks as if we're back to the old sectarian divide, orange versus green in Northern Ireland again.
Yes, it does look as if there's been quite a bit of polarisation this time, and of course I think we'll find that that will be even more evident in the results from the western part of the country, from Fermanagh, South Tyrone and from Mid-Ulster, which are expected later in the afternoon.
Well, with me now is one of the Loyalist heroes of the day. We can describe him as that, indeed one of the leaders of the United Ulster Unionist Coalition, Mr. William Craig, the victor from East Belfast. Congratulations, Mr. Craig. A massive vote there. What are your terms now for the British government?
Well, it's not really the right way to put it. We are going to the United Kingdom Parliament to demand our full rights as citizens of the United Kingdom. We want to have the same standards of democracy. We want to have the same share of representation in the United Kingdom Parliament as any other part of the kingdom. For instance, on the basis of Scotland, we should have 22 members instead of 12.
And no parliament here?
Well, Mr. Wilson has told Scotland that he's preparing to devolve power to Scotland and maintain their representation. Well, if that's good enough for Scotland, it's good enough for Ulster.
Well, now, Mr. Craig, you know as well as I that both Mr. Wilson and Mr. Heath have made it clear that settlement in Northern Ireland on a political basis must include two things: power sharing with the minority community, the Catholic community here, and an Irish dimension. Are those terms totally unacceptable to you?
We're making it plain to Mr. Wilson and to Mr. Heath that we demand exactly the same standards of democracy in Northern Ireland as in any other part of the United Kingdom, and we demand to be treated as full citizens of the United Kingdom. And if there's any section of our community going to rebel against British democracy, then the law should take its course.
Will you agree to share power now with the minority community in any form of government in Northern Ireland?
I'm only prepared to have an elected government in Northern Ireland, conforming to the usual practices of British government.
And will you accept Mr. Enoch Powell as your parliamentary leader now in Westminster? If he gets elected, of course, in South Down, and it looks as if he will.
Well, the question hasn't arisen yet.
I'm sure it's arisen very clearly in your mind and the rest of your colleagues' mind.
Well,
He's not here just to join in and accept your leadership, I'm sure.
He is here to be a member of our team. And
but will you accept him as your leader?
It hasn't arisen.
Will you accept him as your leader?
I'm not prepared to consider a change in leadership until the need arises.
And if that need does arise and his name comes forward, would you express your willingness to serve under him as a leader?
If we thought that it was the right thing to do, of course.
Do you think it's the right thing to do now? That's what I'm asking you at this moment.
I haven't considered them.
I'm sure you have considered it, Mr.
As far
Craig.
as I'm concerned, the need to change the leadership hasn't arisen.
Well, from a triumphant Ulster Unionist Council, back to Alistair Burnett in London.
And we will await those results from Northern Ireland. The recount happening at Bosworth, Adam Butler's seat, where he's being challenged by Mr. Martin Sloman. We are also awaiting the result from Berwick-on-Tweed, which is actually enjoying, if that's the right word, its third election in that constituency within 12 months. So there's still quite a lot to come. Kinross and West Perthshire, that is where another recount is taking place, Alec Douglas-Hume's old seat, and that's one where the Scottish nationalists hope to have a success yet. Now, Bob.
I've just come across an astonishing irony. 10 years ago, last 1 week, we sat together discussing whether Mr. Wilson would enter number 10 with a majority of 4 or 6. Today, 10 years later, we're discussing whether he's likely to return to number 10 with a majority of 3 or 5. This is surely one of the great coincidences of modern British politics. There's one great difference, however, and I'd like just to add this. That is, then, it was a question of a majority over Conservative and Liberal only. There was no other representation in the House, and it ended up 317 for Labour, 304 for Conservative, and 9 for Liberal. This time, it's a much more divided opposition, with the prospect of at least 27 others, including the Nats and so on. My own view is that this will be, therefore, an easier House for the government, granted especially the tremendous preoccupation of the Irish in returning for their own problems, and I would expect he'll be able to govern more effectively in this House than he was able to, and he governed very well for 18 months in 1964.
David, would you
I would
go on
accept that, and I think one must add Mr. Fitt, who does say that he is a Labour man. Irish issues might cut across that. But while he is in Westminster, I should have thought that Mr. Mellish, if he stays as Chief Whip, could count on the support of Mr. Fitt in any crunch situation.
But nevertheless, there are always critics, and while, of course, the Labour Party is saying very boldly and very brightly that they knew they wouldn't get a big majority and all the rest of it, there are those members of the Labour Party, and indeed it's said members of the Labour Cabinet, who are trying to encourage Mr. Wilson to hold a June or July election. How do you think he'd have got on?
I think he would have done better. Certainly the Conservatives I've talked to say, thank God he didn't have it. I mean, they were saying this before the election, before they knew the election results. They were saying, thank God we went put the challenge in June. We did regroup our forces. People saw that Labour hadn't necessarily got the answer, or enough people saw, for us to be in with a chance this autumn.
And with the news that the Conservatives have held Monmouth, that was one of the outside chances that Labour could have taken. And this is the situation just at 5 minutes past 2. And the prediction that we still give for this election is Labour a narrow overall majority. Labour 320, Conservatives 276, Liberals 12, and others 27. And still Labour with an overall majority. And just time to say there, before we saw the prediction still standing firm, the Monmouth result. Not a surprise, in fact, David, but just clears one of the little hurdles out of the way.
One of the doubts. I'm sure that Bosworth is the only seat Labour can gain, and it makes the difference between a majority of 3 and a majority of 5.
Some results from the southeast now. Braintree, Chertsey and Walton, Sir Geoffrey Patty, and Hertford and Stevenage, Mrs. Shirley Williams there.
Keith Kyle put his vote up by 3%, even though he couldn't campaign. The Liberals dropped in all those seats.
And that's an opportunity now to bring in Sue Lawley for another look at the southeast. We're not volatile in the southeast at all, are we?
I must say, actually, with those 3 results, Alistair, I'm delighted to say we are now complete. Both the maps, the GLC area and the southeast area, are complete. Let's just take a look at the totals there. Labour, of course, made 1 gain in the GLC area, bringing their total up to 51, to Conservatives 41, that 1 gain of Ilford North. And in the southeast, in the home counties, they made 4 gains, bringing their total up to 14. Conservatives with, again, the great stronghold there of 54 seats, but they have lost 4 of them: Rochester and Chatham, Welland and Hatfield, Hemel Hempstead and Oxford. So, just for the record now, let's give you a few records. The lowest poll was in Chelsea, where in fact only half the voters turned out. The highest poll was in Hemel Hempstead, where 81.7% of them turned out. And funnily enough, that's also the constituency with the lowest majority. Robin Corbett scraped home there with a majority of just 0.7%. A majority of 485 votes he got there. The seat reflecting the highest swing to Labour was Hackney South and Shoreditch, where Ron Brown, that's Lord George Brown's brother, held his seat with a 5.3% swing. Sir Bernard Brain picked up the highest swing to Tories of 0.3% in Essex South East, while Bill Benyon held on to Buckingham with a nil swing between the 2 major parties. The National Front got their highest vote in Hackney North and Stoke Newington, but they still didn't save their deposit. The Liberals got their highest vote in their highest hope. That was Newbury, of course, one of their highest hopes in the whole country, a vote of 40.3% there. And they polled their lowest vote in Labour's Chief Whip Bob Mellish's seat in Bermondsey. Peter Shaw in Stepney and Poplar gets the prize for the highest majority in the area, a majority of 67.4%. And that's all the prizes I'm handing out today, because I think we are now, as I say, Alistair, quite complete, and I might even be able to go home.
Well, very good. You're very lucky. We are still going to wait here for 1 or 2 more coming from much further afield, Sue. But, David, here is a point. Actually, inside London, nothing very much happened in this election.
Well, there were much bigger swings in the East End area, the safe seats. In the marginals, Labour held on, the Conservatives held on rather notably in Upminster and the Ford Motor Company around Dagenham. They also held on, Barney Hayhoe held on rather surprisingly in Brentford and Isleworth.
Is this a matter of organisation that's saving these seats?
I'm not sure. I think it's more sophisticated voting by the Liberals. The Liberal vote dropped, not just in London, this applies to the whole country, dropped everywhere by from 0 to 4% in seats they were fighting again, and it dropped, it seems to me, they went rather to the party that was the incumbent party, and this is why the swing in the marginals, in the Conservative-held marginals, was only 1.1%, was so low, so that a 2% swing, which should have put the Conservatives, put the Labour Party comfortably in a majority, has only allowed them just to scrape home. And here we are with the supreme irony of waiting for Bosworth. You remember Bosworth? The 17th seat, the seat that just on the swing chart had to go over to give Labour a majority. Well, it seems to be the 320th, not the 318th seat, when the results are coming in.
Well, I remember Bosworth. Somebody picked up a crown on the battlefield, didn't he? And this might be the crown of an overall majority that really works and one that doesn't.
Well, I don't know that the difference between 3 and 5 is the critical one, though it may be after a few by-elections.
Well, it's certainly a late declarer now, and with that one still to come, Berwick-on-Tweed still to come, Kinross and West Perthshire to come. Otherwise, I think they're rather the far-flung highlands and islands that we are still awaiting. Berwick-on-Tweed is actually recounting. We have the word on that. And
the third successive election in which it's recounted. In the by-election, it recounted with a majority of 54 or something. 500 last time had a recount. Poor Alan Beath is having another one this time.
Well, he certainly lives on the edge of a precipice there. So we'll wait and see what happens. With the situation that Labour now has 316 seats in hand, a gain of 18 overall. Conservative 273, a net loss of 20. Liberals 9 seats at the moment, a net loss of 1. And there are 18 others, a figure building up from the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, the United Ulster Unionists in Northern Ireland, as well as the Social Democratic and Labour Party. Conservatives hold Cirencester and Tewkesbury. They'd be surprised if they did anything else. Some other results. And Bedvelty, Mr Neil Kinnock, making a name for himself, a young Labour member on the left wing. Monmouth, the Conservative, holding there. Brecon and Ragnar, Mr Carwyn Roderick, holding the seat.
It was the outside chance of a seat going Maverick. It hasn't done so.
And here's Sir Tim Kitson, Mr Heath's PPS, and indeed he had Mr Heath as a lodger for a while after the last election when Mr Heath had to leave number 10 Downing Street. The Don Valley, Barkston Ash. Now, I think there's a chance to see how Enoch Powell is getting on in South Down. They have been counting, of course, all day today. It's a big number of votes to be counted. Let's go over to South Down and see what the state of play is.
Well, Mr. Powell arrived here about 15 minutes ago. He is probably preparing himself to gild the Orange Lily after the big United Unionist victories in Belfast and with the Reverend Ian Paisley in Antrim. We expect the result in about 45 minutes. Mr. Powell's people are confident of victory, but the poll, although larger than in the February 74 election, is perhaps just a little lower than they might have hoped for. Nevertheless, it should be big enough to ensure a fairly comfortable majority, perhaps of about 7,000 for Mr. Enoch Powell. Already in his campaign speeches, in fact, Mr. Powell had been talking about possible tactics on the floor of the House of Commons, and I'm sure we'll hear more of that later in the day. That is, when the South Down result is declared in about 45 minutes' time.
That's Brian Walker. I think we have an opportunity of speaking to another of the night's and day's losers. Remember Mr. Eddie Milne, who took on the local Labour Party in Blyth, particularly over the question of corruption there. Here he is now in Newcastle, speaking to Luke Pacey after the result.
Mr. Milne, why do you think you lost this election?
Well, we hardly lost it. It was a draw, but we were narrowly defeated. But I'm absolutely sure that the power put into this election by Transport House, by the northern region of the party and by the National Union of Mine Workers, in what appeared to be a public relations campaign, we just didn't have the type of organisation to match it, although we had a tremendous number of dedicated, loyal people around us.
You're saying here, in fact, that there was a move by Transport House and everyone else in the Labour Party to get you out of this seat.
Oh, yes. They've been trying to do this since 1969. If they shoot at the target long enough, they hit it, and that's what they did tonight.
But you still polled a tremendous number of votes.
Oh, yes. I feel that behind me, I have the support of the vast majority of the people of Blyth. Anyone who can run a Labour candidate so close, whose campaign has been so expensively conducted and manpower drafted into the division on such a massive scale, can only feel pleased at having got so near to victory.
What sort of a campaign was it?
Well, it was a wonderful campaign. We fought it on the issues of the election. We fought it on the need to get our Labour Party back in Blyth again, because, as we all know in the North East, the standards set by leading figures in this Labour movement of ours is a disgrace to the memory of the pioneers of the labour movement who laid the foundations of something that was decent and lasting. That has been destroyed. The fight to get it back has got to continue.
Mr. Milne, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was Edward Milne talking to Jake Kelly up in
318
Tyneside.
seats. Labour has now got a clear majority in results declared.
With Hemsworth coming in order to produce that. And Labour have now the overall majority, which they've been promised, but not, of course, as big a one as they had been promised. Well, David, it has happened, and Mr. Wilson knows what the future is. Just Bosworth to come, a second recount in Kinross, but that doesn't affect Labour very much. They've held Gloucestershire West there, which was a very outside possibility for the Tories, and so that really does look rather like the end of the general election for Mr. Wilson.
Well, 319 or 320, we wait for the recount in Bosworth. I must say the Kinross result is remarkable. The Scottish Nationalists have been very much involved in tight things. The two closest majorities so far have been their majority of 22 in East Dunbarton and their majority of 30 in Galloway. If they were to pick off Kinross, the second recount does mean almost certainly a majority of under 100. And if they were to pick off Kinross, the same sort of majority, they really would have been the luckiest party of the night.
Well, now, we heard from Mr. Wilson during the night, and I thought a very interesting interview indeed with Michael Charlton, and then we heard from Mr. Wilson at the Huyton Labour Club, and we hope that he will be speaking again this afternoon, now that he's had full time to digest most of the results. Just a footnote there to Mr. Eddie Milne, whom we saw a moment ago, speaking in Blyth rather bitterly about his treatment. He did, in fact, run the local machine there to only 78 votes. Well, there's 318 seats now in Mr. Wilson's possession. That is an overall majority over all other parties in the new House of Commons. We go now to one of the places still declaring, Northern Ireland, Vince Hanna in Belfast.
And thank you, Alistair. With me now is another of the successful candidates, the leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, a very triumphant Gerry Fitt. An overall majority has just been declared for Mr. Harold Wilson. Can he count on your vote?
Mr. Harold Wilson and any Labour administration could always have counted on my vote. I make my position quite clear that in Northern Ireland I'm a socialist. It is very hard to be a socialist in Northern Ireland without in some way being tainted either a unionist socialist or an anti-partitionist socialist. I say that I'm a socialist. Since being elected to Westminster in 1966, I have at all times supported the Labour administration, except when there were very specific cases on the introduction of the emergency powers prolongation of that particular act. I reserve the right to vote against.
It's a very tight squeeze this time for Mr. Wilson. Does this mean that you're going to be tramping through the lobbies night after night and not staying in Belfast?
It was a very tight squeeze the last time. I remember very well when the Labour government initiated this legislation to repeal the hated Industrial Relations Act of the Conservative Party and putting forward their own legislation. I think that they survived on a number of occasions by one vote, and I'm glad to say that that vote was mine.
Will you, if Ivan Cooper wins Mid-Ulster, will you commit now, prepared to commit Ivan Cooper's vote to Harold Wilson as well?
I think Ivan Cooper's a socialist as well, so yes, and he and I certainly were not going to do anything to bring about the downfall of the defeat of the Labour government if it is acting in a socialist way.
Now, let's look at the Northern Ireland situation. The overall position in Belfast is very encouraging for the Loyalists. A massive swing, gain of 12% all over in the Belfast seats. Is this the beginning, again, of the old sectarian divide, the orange versus green?
I don't fully accept that everyone who cast their vote for Bill Craig or for Mr. Bradford in South Belfast or for John Carson, that they are so intransigent as their leaders would have us believe, that they are opposed to a power-sharing or a partnership administration, that they will not accept an Irish dimension under any circumstances. Those personalities, they receive their vote on a number of issues. And I would be very, very hopeful, after the tragedy that we have lived through over this past number of years, that they would now begin to see that they are safe in their constituencies, and instead of letting themselves be pushed by the hardline and transient infection, that they would begin to do a bit of leading.
Are you prepared now that you've won with an increased majority to stretch out a hand of friendship to the Protestant working classes in Belfast? You're a Belfast man, you say you're a socialist, you're a working class representative. Now is the time, surely, when you could say something to people like Ken Gibson, who opposed you, to people in East Belfast. Is there some way in which the working classes of both Catholic and Protestant...
Am I prepared now to stretch out the hand of friendship to the Protestant working classes?
Yes.
I have been doing that since the first day and hour and minute that I understood about politics. I'm a socialist. I don't seek sectarian support.
Is there any way then you think you can break down the mistrust they have for you?
I was watching boxes this morning, and I believe this may contravene, by the way, the secrecy which is attached to the counting of votes. I was watching boxes this morning in West Belfast, and those boxes came out of polling stations which were not situated on the Falls Road and in the so-called Catholic or Republican areas of Belfast. I saw many votes coming out there for Jerry Fitt. I've seen them in previous elections.
I don't think we would doubt the fact that you get Protestant support. What I'm saying to you is there any solution which you now have in a position of power to overcome the mistrust which a large section of the Protestant working classes have for you?
I think the Protestant working class have been deluded and exploited by self-seeking politicians over a number of years. I have at all times wanted to extend that hand of friendship. Perhaps it has been taken in a very minute sort of way. I would hope that they would realise that it is only by coming together in partnership or power sharing, by recognising that there are two communities in Northern Ireland, that we can ever hope to bring peace. I certainly will be available if and when they want to talk to me.
Power sharing is one thing, the Irish dimension is another. It was the Irish dimension that wrecked your executive, this insistence on a Council of Ireland. Do you still insist that as part of a package to take part in government, you want to have an Irish dimension?
The Irish dimension was totally misrepresented by the self-seeking politicians who sought to exclude people like Ken Gibson, who fought me in this election. There have been politicians, and they have at all times kept the real voice of the Protestant working class out of the picture. The Irish dimension had all sorts of safeguards. They didn't have to have anything to do with it because there was the unanimity rule and all of it, but it was seriously misrepresented, and a great deal of hysteria and emotion was built up within the Protestant community.
Well, I hope the hysteria and emotion will die down in the future. And from Belfast and Jerry Fitt back to Alistair Burnett in London.
And I'll go straight to Bob Mackenzie.
Well, let's look at the state of the parties, if we may. Remember, in the early part of the evening, I said that top right-hand figure had to become 17 for Mr. Wilson to have an overall majority. Well, it got to 18 and then got stuck, as it were. Immediately beneath that 18 in the corner, the Tories had to reverse that, really. Had to have 21 or 22 gains, and they've had that many losses almost. And you see what's happened there to the others as well. Now, let's look at the share of the vote, because that is also part of the story. And if you do, you see that the Labour Party, in fact, has got 40% of the vote. That's the top left-hand corner, and unlikely now to change. That is the smallest share of the vote that a majority government has taken office with in 50 years. Labour's share is up a bit. That's the figure immediately below the 40%, and the Conservative share is down a bit, as you'll see. That's what we call the swing between the two major parties. I think it's just worth noting, to take the third along the top, Liberals at 18.5, it's slightly more than half as many votes as the Conservatives got, and pretty nearly half as many votes as Labour got in this election. And that, again, is the source of Jeremy Thorpe's argument that he's been pretty badly done by as far as the electoral system is concerned, yet again.
David?
If you translate what Bob has just said into absolute votes, the Labour Party at the moment is just 1 million votes ahead of the Conservatives, 11,370,000 to the Conservatives 10,360,000. The Liberals have now passed 5.25 million, 5,260,000. Well, that'll change a little bit. But here there is a situation. Labour can say we have a mandate, 1 million more people voted for us than voted for the Conservatives. It takes away the thing last election when Labour got most seats but fewer votes. On the other hand, the Liberals have, as Bob Mackenzie says, their grievance, and there are 1.5 million votes, more than have been ever cast before, cast for others.
Do you get the feeling this is really rather a quiet afternoon, David, that there have been great dramas in the afternoons of second days, but this one has almost happened as if it were meant and relentlessly, and Labour drove on and it tipped it over, it faltered a little, but there it's there.
Well, this is the 9th election I've sat in this chair, and in 4 of them, somebody has gone to the palace, or the question of whether they should go to the palace has arisen. This afternoon it doesn't arise. Mr. Wilson has won his majority. There is no question of his resigning, no question of his having to make any snap changes in his cabinet. I'm doubtless he will reorganise affairs a little bit after this election, but no leading figures on the Labour side have been defeated. There's no massive change that has to be made, but it is a different feel entirely. Do you remember, was 1970, the Queen was
going to Ascot, I think, and we saw, or going to Windsor. It was at Ascot. We saw these shots all through the afternoon.
She wasn't allowed to go to Ascot in 70 because they didn't allow racing on general election days then. They do now, actually. It would be all right today, but I think the Queen is actually up in Balmoral still, isn't she? She would have had to come south if there were going to be a change in government. No doubt she read the opinion polls. David, just one thing. The Labour performance in Wales against Plaid Cymru. Now, have Labour a bit to be satisfied with that?
On the whole, the Plaid Cymru did very well in those 3 seats, the 2 seats it held already and the 1 other seat. They got comfortable majorities in those 3 seats. They're nowhere near to victory anywhere else. Over the rest of Wales, they kept more or less level pegging, up a little bit here, down a little bit there. They were down, in fact, in Aberdare and Caerphilly, the only 2 South Wales seats where they polled a substantial proportion of the vote, quarter of the vote or more.
And well, here's the Plaid Cymru seats, I think. There we are, Meirionydd, Carnarvon, which they had before, and Carmarthen, Gwynfor Evans' success there. Now, last time, again, there was a slight swing to the Conservatives in Wales. How have they fared?
No, the Conservatives have held on in Pembroke, which is their most vulnerable seat, and they've held on in Barry and Monmouth, which were outside chances to lose if there'd been a huge swing. On the other hand, there has been a swing back to the Labour Party. There was a 3.5% swing in Cardiff. I think it was the largest swing in virtually any big city of the country.
Well, now, Robin has with him Mr. Peter Thomas, a former Secretary of State for Wales and former chairman of the Conservative Party. Robin?
Mr. Thomas, what satisfaction do you draw from the results in Wales for the Conservative Party?
Well, having regard to the national trend, I think that we can draw satisfaction from the fact that we've saved all our seats. We have 8 seats in Wales. 1966 we only had 3.
As a former chairman of the Conservative Party, do you think the party could have won, having regard to the narrowness of the result, if its campaign had just had that little more zip and punch?
No, I thought the campaign was done properly, actually. I supported the technique of the campaign throughout.
The low-key national unity technique?
Low-key.
You don't think in hindsight it might have been a bit zippier and tougher?
I don't think it would have been an honest campaign. I think it was right that we should just stick to what we thought was the problem that the country faced, and we should put forward our solution. And I think we were right to do so.
There's been some talk about Mr. Heath's political future now. Do you share my view that there's not much likelihood of the Conservative MPs demanding a change in leadership in the near future?
Well, I shouldn't think so. I thought Ted Heath fought an admirable campaign. I have enormous admiration for him. And I certainly would give him my full support. It depends. If leadership comes up, then of course the parliamentary party will choose. But I have no doubt that Ted Heath would win.
Do you think he would like to have an election and offer himself for election at the beginning of the new session? That's not in your rules, I know, but
no.
Do you think he might like to do that, to give himself a new vote of confidence?
I don't know. I haven't discussed the matter with him.
Why do you think, in your campaign and when you went around the country, what was the biggest difficulty you found in voters' minds about voting Conservative?
Well, it was interesting because I spent some time in Wales, and I found, for instance, that devolution was very much a minor issue in all the campaigns in Wales.
And what was your biggest difficulty? What was the thing people said to you as the reason they didn't want to vote Conservative this time, apart from committed Labour voters?
I think people were influenced by the fear which was being expressed. By
fear of industrial unrest.
Fear of industrial unrest. And I thought that was an extremely effective electoral tactic which was used, because undoubtedly people in all parties...
3-day week all over again and that sort of thing?
Yes, people just think in terms of the militant unions probably being in a position to cooperate better with a Labour government. And this, the Labour candidates, of course, made full use of this. I thought it was a pretty bad tactic, but nevertheless people, I think, did have that fear.
Thank you, Peter Thomas. Alistair?
And I think we have an opportunity to take some more results. Going up north, Geoffrey Rippon, the shadow Foreign Secretary, and of course Mr. Heath, European negotiator. In Durham, Mr. William Hughes. In Durham Northwest, Mr. Ernest Armstrong, strong mining seats.
If we didn't know there was a recount in Berwick, we'd be drawing attention to Hexham, but we know that Berwick is on the edge. Berwick is next door to Hexham.
And now from some Conservative strongholds in Malden, Faversham, Mr. Roger Moat. Now that used to be a marginal seat. Farnham, Mr. Maurice Macmillan.
That was a seat where the Liberals had some hopes. In fact, they dropped 5% of the vote there. Still in second place comfortably.
And here we have Brigg and Scunthorpe. In Louth, remember Mr. Geoffrey Archer was unable to stand this time, and Hemsworth, that's a big Labour majority in a mining area, gave Mr. Wilson his 318th seat.
The remarkable result there is Louth, because it's the only seat where the Liberals have made a really big gain in votes. They gained 5% of the vote there, the Conservatives dropped 6%. It may have been the troubles over Mr. Archer's departure that led to that, breaking away from the pattern of results we've had elsewhere.
Well, perhaps they didn't know Mr. Michael Brotherton. He had to fight the seat at rather short notice. Joe Godber, a former Minister of Agriculture in Conservative government at Grantham, Mr. Richard Boddy, Holland with Boston, very anti-European member, and Norfolk South, Mr. John McGregor, one of Mr. Heath's former personal assistants.
Low swings in Norfolk.
And let's go out to the West Country again. In Gloucestershire West, that's the one that the Tories might look at 1 year, and also Bridgewater and Cirencester.
And a swing to the Conservatives. We were right to draw attention to Gloucestershire West. Only a 400 majority, a swing to the Conservatives, the second biggest swing to the Conservatives in the whole of the election.
Just a note there, Cirencester and Tewkesbury, Mr. Nick Ridley, he was one of the unsuccessful ministers at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and of course he has been a critic of Mr. Heath's subsequent economic policies. No doubt his will be one of the voices, perhaps, questioning some aspects of recent Conservative policy after this election. Now, we are waiting still for Mr. Enoch Powell's result. The last, perhaps, big personality there at risk, and I think we are getting a picture from Southdown now, so let's go over. Now, Mr. Powell, we have seen with his wife standing, waiting for the count to be completed, and the returning officer. Everybody would suppose it was a foregone conclusion of all the 635 election results. Perhaps Mr. Powell's return in Southdown has been the most forecast and the most taken for granted. But still, it is a moment. Can anything go wrong? It is, after all, a seat which contains a strong following, or used to contain a strong personal following, for Mr. Brian Faulkner, the former chief executive in the power-sharing administration, very much an opponent of Mr. Powell's. It was thought at one time that Faulknerites might even have run a candidate in order to split that vote. And let's go to another count. This, in fact, is a recount now. We're going to at Berwick-on-Tweed. If we can pick up the picture from Berwick. This is where Mr. Alan Beath, the Liberal, is under some siege from Charles Baker Cresswell, the Conservative. Let's go to Berwick.
It's obviously a very close thing once again in the Berwick-upon-Tweed constituency. Alan Beath, a very important Liberal, holds it with a majority of only 443, and there is now a full recount going on, which I understand was asked for by Mr. Beath. This is Jake Kelly in Berwick-on-Tweed.
Now, Jake, you can confirm that Mr. Beath asked for it. Well, that's a very interesting detail. Mr. Beath, who just scraped through by 443 back in February. If there has been any little push by the Conservatives there, then Mr. Beath might well be the man in trouble. And it is a curious reversal of circumstances that just next door in Berwick and East Lothian, of course, the Conservatives lost that seat, the one which they actually picked up back in February. So it's nip and tuck in Berwick and Berwickshire, just as it has been down in the southwest. So here we have Labour with 318 seats, an outright majority over all other parties, Conservatives 274. Let's look at the Labour gains in this second general election of 1974. Started off with taking Lincoln from Mr. Dick Taverne, the Democratic Socialist, and then a string of successes against the Conservatives. Nelson and Cone, Rossendale, Oxford, Rochester and Chatham, Southampton Test, Ipswich, Bolton West, Ilford North, Peterborough, Bristol North West, Birmingham Selly Oak, and Leicester South. And more, Welwyn and Hatfield, Bury and Ratcliffe, Hemel Hempstead, Berwick and East Lothian, Lichfield and Tamworth, and finishing again with a success from a Labour maverick, Mr. Edward Milne, in Blyth, by, in fact, only 78 votes. And I think we have some more full results. Here's Sir Geoffrey de Freitas back in Kettering,
with a substantial increase in his vote at the expense of the Liberals, a 3% switch from Liberal to Labour there.
As Sir Geoffrey de Freitas, of course, he went away to become a colonial administrator during the high days of Mr. Harold Macmillan. He then returned and took this seat at Kettering just before the general election of 1964. He's a strong pro-European. For one reason or another, Mr. Wilson's eye has not fallen on him for ministerial preferment. And in Kensington, Sir Brandon Rhys-Williams holding the seat, Labour coming into second place, and it now looks distinctly a Conservative marginal, David.
Very big swing to Labour there, 3.6%.
And Mr. Robin Maxwell Hislop defending Tiverton against the Liberals pretty comfortably.
But the Liberals hold their vote on very well there, 1.1% drop only.
And in Ayrshire South, Mr. Jim Sillars, now he's one of the Labour men who really pushed for greater devolution inside the Scottish Labour Party, taking on Mr. William Ross, the Secretary of State for Scotland, and forcing his way through in a special conference so that devolution became Labour's official policy.
He kept the SNP increase there down to 3%, well, much, much below the average.
Of course, it's a strong mining seat. And here's North Down, Mr. James Kilfedder. Well, it would take a great earthquake to get rid of him from North Down.
10% increase in his vote.
And Mr. Peter Rost in Derbyshire South East, he had a recount, but he saved it by 1,000 votes. And Mr. John Cockcroft in Nantwich, a safe Conservative seat up in the northwest, Cheshire way.
4% drop in the Liberal vote there.
And now here in Daventry, we are picking up some of the Conservative strongholds that are pushing up the total of the Conservative vote and the total of the Conservative
Slight swing to
seats.
the Conservatives in Daventry.
That seems to me to bring us up to date with those results, and it's the recount seats that we still have our eyes on. Labour holding the Dearne Valley. There, as you saw, one of the big mining rural seats. And Labour now have an overall majority of 2 seats over all other parties, with still Bosworth in particular to be settled. Now, Bob, share of the vote.
Just another look at the share of the vote board then, where you'll see that Labour on the top corner there, left hand, is exactly at 40%. With 5 results to come, it's conceivable it might just shade under 40%, granted there's some Northern Ireland seats and odds and sods to come. So that's the position, though, 40% against the Conservatives, reading across the top, 36%, and almost 36.5%. Liberals at 18.5%, half as many votes as the Conservatives got, and almost half as many votes as Labour got, and others at 5.1%. And Labour has increased its share, looking across the second line, by 2.2%. Conservatives down 2%, Liberals down 1%. Others up almost 1%.
Well, now, David, you were making the point that, in fact, it's a majority of 3 seats. You're taking the Speaker into account there?
Well, for these figures, we have put the Speaker in the Conservative ranks. One thing, there's been a lot of gossip suggesting that Mr. Lloyd might retire in the course of the Parliament. If he did, it's quite certain that a Conservative would be returned in his very safe seat in the Wirral. So it's not unreasonable to do this, and it comes to the party bargaining about filling the chairmanships. So I don't think it's unreasonable to consider the Speaker as a Conservative for this purpose.
Now, on that particular point, I think it's a pity myself that the old practice of not opposing the Speaker has been dropped, both by the Labour Party and by the Liberals, who fought against Mr. Lloyd, and indeed made it, I think one of the parties made it a point of their campaign to say that he was no use as a local MP because he couldn't take up local people's problems and questions in the House. Now, how do you regard that?
Well, there was a select committee back in 1938 which did actually recommend that they should create a notional constituency called St Stephen's without any electors, to which the Speaker should move. Because, in fact, Speakers never go back to the back benches. They're always given a peerage if they want it, and go away when they cease to be Speaker, because it's thought it wouldn't be dignified to go back to the back benches. So I don't actually see why you shouldn't follow this. It is a little hard not to have somebody who can publicly take up a grievance. I'm sure that Mr. Lloyd, like Mr. King before him, looks after his constituents and answers their mail and sends letters to departments and does all that sort of thing. But you may want somebody actually to speak up positively for you and lead deputations and that sort of thing, which the Speaker can't do properly.
On the other hand, would he really be Speaker of the House of Commons if he were not in other ways a man elected as they were, as his colleagues were, if it ever came to a question of the privileges of the House and so on? Here's Mr.
But he
Selwyn
isn't
White.
elected as they were. His position is entirely different once he's elected Speaker. Nobody is going to be elected Speaker who hasn't been a Member of Parliament for a number of years and isn't accepted as a member of the club.
Bob, would you give him a special seat?
Well, seeing Selwyn Lloyd's picture reminds me to say what a remarkable political career he's had. I mean, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, an intensely controversial figure in both those roles, and yet translated to Speaker, something that's very unusual, to go from those great offices of state to Speaker, and obviously succeeding in overcoming any previous feeling that he might have been highly partisan in the days of Suez or whenever it was.
Of course, he got a lot of sympathy, I think, when he was dismissed so summarily by Mr. Harold Macmillan, and then I think he got a wave of sympathy when he came back. He had a period, I think, as leader of the House of Commons when Sir Alec Douglas-Home became Prime Minister in '63, and it was felt then that he had really won his spurs. He was a good leader of the House, seemed to be sympathetic with it. That may have stood him in some good stead in getting the Speaker's job at the end.
Yep.
Good. David?
Well, I was just thinking, I can't remember the quotation exactly. There was some late 19th century Prime Minister who said, all speakers are thought to be indispensable, all speakers are thought to be wonderful, and all are very easily replaced.
But if there were to be a retirement by Selwyn Lloyd in this Parliament, it would create problems. Presumably Labour would expect...
As it did when Sir Harry Hilton Foster died suddenly in 1965, when there was a majority of 3 in the House.
Yes, and Labour would be in the position of having probably to find a Speaker if they were prepared to, they would want it.
But Mr. Wilson got round that one as well, of course, showing his adeptness in these situations. 2 more results. Here's the Labour Party stronghold in the Dearne Valley. And down in the south in the Fareham, Dr. Bennett.
A very interesting statistic has just been found by the people working on the figures behind me, that the swings to Labour were smaller in the seats where the census shows a very high proportion of owner-occupiers. It may be that the Conservative housing pledge did in fact reap dividends in votes as they hoped, but they were rather disappointed during the campaign. It wasn't more obviously having its effect.
So, with Labour 319 seats, Conservatives 274, and waiting for a number of these seats in the South Down and in Scotland still to come in. And time, I think, to go over now to Robin.
And with me are 5 people involved in the world of industry to tell us what they think are the priorities and the main problems facing this new government with its narrow majority. In Birmingham, I have Mr. Adrian Cadbury, Deputy Chairman of Cadbury Schweppes Limited. You're not yet Chairman, are you, Mr. Cadbury?
No.
Thank you for joining us. I'll introduce the others first, if I may. In Belfast, Mr. Philip Foreman. Have I got Mr. Philip Foreman of, I'm sorry, of Short and Harland, but perhaps he'll come later. Never mind. We have with me in London Mr. Richard O'Brien, Group Director of Manpower Delta Metal Company, and Chairman of the Employment Policy Committee of the CBI.
Yes, sir.
And Professor Ben Roberts, Head of the Department of Industrial Relations of the London School of Economics, and Mr. Richard Brigginshaw, General Secretary of NatSopa, the National Society of Operative Printers, Graphical and Media Personnel. Have I got it right?
That's right.
I never get those names right. Now, gentlemen, what is the priority for this government? Ben Roberts.
Well, the priority for this government is to deal with the problem of inflation.
Yes, but in what particular respect on the immediate field so far as industry is concerned?
Yes, well, the first thing it's got to do is to somehow damp down what is still a rising pressure for higher pay. We're presently running pay increases according to the last figures, to around 20%, and all the evidence indicates that over the next few months that figure's going to go up.
Do you have confidence in the trade union side of the social contract to effect the necessary degree of wage restraint?
No, I don't, for the simple reason that the social contract is such an ambiguous document. It allows for so many loopholes that I'm afraid there'll be enormous pressures this winter. And in fact, the underlying real trend of incomes is much higher than the 20% because it covers all sorts of other costs which are not included in pure wages.
Do you agree with Mr. Jeremy Thorpe and the Liberals and the Times that a wage freeze is necessary now or very shortly?
Well, I think it's going to come to that.
Mr. Richard Brigginshaw, what do you say about the inadequacies of the social contract and the necessity of a freeze?
We've been through the wage freeze procession of events over a long period. And it really finished up in the 3-day week at the beginning of the year. And I think it's unfortunate and even a little unfair that the electorate are not given a bigger majority to the government to get on with...
Why unfair?
Well, unfair because of their record. I think the record since February has not been recognised in the sense that we were on a 3-day week, we did have a miners' dispute, all these things have been disposed of,
and so easily forgotten. And what's been forgotten, it's unfair, I think, in this sense, is being forgotten the contribution, the ingredients of the circumstances that arose in February. And one of those was wage freezing, wage control. What we need is the implementation, the full implementation of the social compact itself, which is not only to do with wages, but to do with all the other social factors that provide the climate for us to make the improvements we need.
May I come to Mr. Richard O'Brien and ask you, are you one of those businessmen who, on the whole, conservative though they may be in politics, wanted to see a Labour government with just this kind of result because they thought it would be easier for a Labour government with opposition support to deal with industrial difficulty and crisis?
I think that could be the result. I think in the short term, this may be the best result from the point of view of the immediate control of inflation, particularly from the point of view of negotiators, people like myself.
Do you have confidence in the social contract, or do you want the employers somehow to be made a party to it?
I think it's crucial that the employers be made part of the social contract.
You're not a rogue employer, are you?
I hope not.
But how do we solve the problem of employers getting the blame for responding to union demands and being accused of breaking a social contract which they haven't been a party to?
Well, because employers, at the end of the day, are concerned with the survival of their firms. And if they're under intolerable pressures, they are tempted to give way to those immediate pressures. They need support from something like a social contract.
Do you think that in the social contract, now that this is the policy of the elected government, again, that it would be a good idea and a practical idea to have some kind of independent, mediating, arbitrating agency to say to people whether a particular negotiating offer is outside or inside the social contract?
No, I don't think so. I think the immediate steps are clear. The government should call in the employers and the unions with a view to reinforcing the social contract. It must be a tripartite contract if it is to work at all.
Can I bring in Mr. Adrian Cadbury in Birmingham?
Yes.
What, do you agree with that?
I think the really essential thing now is to get across just how serious the industrial situation is. Up till now, we've dealt with the wages end of inflation, but what we have is a very real crisis within industry. And just, if I could just quote two figures. One is that if you look at the gross trading profits of industrial and commercial companies in the first half of this year, and allow for stock appreciation and allow for proper depreciation and tax, the answer is a negative figure. Now, the second one is that if you look at the estimated financial deficit for this year for the company sector, it is of the order of £3,000 million. That means that if you look at the money that industry has to spend on fixed assets, on buildings and on machinery, and on the money that it requires for working capital, raw materials, work in progress, and stocks, then the difference between those two is a negative figure of £3,000 million, 3 times the figure that we've ever had to meet before.
What's the action that you are asking for?
Well, this is really the point. We require action on 2 fronts, and quickly. One is, of course, on the operation of the prices code. This is on the profitability part, the first of those two.
You mean ability for industry to raise prices?
The ability of industry to make a higher level of profit. If it is, in fact, making negative
prices.
If it is making negative profits, which is the situation for the first half of this year, then the only thing you can do as an industrialist is to cut your business back to a level at which it is back in profit. Now, that means a sharp reduction in employment.
When trade unionists be liable to say, but if you're going to let prices go up, that's part of the social contract which prevents us from complying with wage restraints.
I think there's a slight confusion here. The point is this, that at the moment we're operating in a situation in which profitability in real terms is negative and in which money is flowing out of the business. Now, really, even putting prices up in that situation is not going to restore the situation fast enough.
You want cash from the government?
We must have cash back in, and of course the simplest way of doing this is to try and find some way of meeting the problem of stock appreciation during a period of inflation.
What's your solution to that particular problem?
Well, the simplest thing to do, I think, would be to take some quite arbitrary solution and say that 90% of the write-up of stocks between the beginning and the end of this year should, in fact, not be taken into account for taxation, and that we should get some credit for this.
Well, perhaps Mr. Dennis Healy is watching and listening to your advice, but may I bring in now Mr. Philip Foreman in Belfast of Short Harland? Mr. Foreman, can you hear me?
I can.
What are your particular needs and priorities at this time, either with regard to cash or the nationalisation proposals, or whatever you like to say?
Well, of course, the economy here in Northern Ireland is very closely linked with the United Kingdom, and what goes on in the United Kingdom automatically affects us here. So our requirements are exactly the same as they are in Great Britain.
Mr. Enoch Powell was reported to have stirred up some controversy by his reported objection, I don't want to do him an injustice, but reported objection to government money going to your firm. Have I got it right?
No, I think you've got it completely wrong.
Well, that's why I asked you so that you could correct me.
I think, in fact, he's alleged to have made some comment as far as Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilders, are concerned. I happen to be Short Brothers and Harland, who are the aircraft builders.
Yes, but that is also involved with government money, is it not?
Yes, we have a majority government shareholding.
Yes.
But we are a profitable organisation. We are not in financial difficulties. And I think he was referring particularly to Harland and Wolff.
And are you going to be taken over under the Labour government's proposals for nationalising the aircraft industry?
No, apparently not. I gather that the plan would be that we would be left to one side for two reasons. Firstly, the government, I believe, has adequate control with its 70% shareholding already. There's no point in disturbing that. And secondly, there is a Northern Ireland situation. I think it is a policy, at least of the last government, to leave Shorts to one side.
And can I just interrupt, Mr. Foreman, to just point out to people that the Conservatives hold Bosworth, and perhaps Dr. David Butler would like to comment on that immediately.
That means that the Labour Party will have an overall majority of 3 seats over all other parties. That is to say, if we count the Speaker as a Conservative, which I shouldn't have done in some ways. I didn't mean to impugn the Speaker's neutrality. I also have to apologise because I gather there have been complaints about misrepresenting the Select Committee of 1938, which after long deliberation actually said the Stevens seat was not a good idea. So I have actually slightly misrepresented facts.
Well, now, back to Robin.
Thank you. Now, thank you, Mr. Foreman. I'd like to bring in Mr. Brigginshaw now to comment on what the 3 industrialists have said.
Well, I think
particularly about the need to ease price control so as to ease the cash difficulties of industry.
We should be in a problem. We shall have a problem right away if we think that we can give a free price uplift. What we have to do is to keep the price regulations. It's a part of the compact. The compact itself is something more than just wages and prices. It's a whole process, a living process that can be developed. It's so important to us, it's so useful to us, but as soon as you break one area of it, then, of course, with the possibilities of ups and downs, you immediately create
well, then what's your solution to the industry's problem of cash and confidence at this time? Because bankrupt firms can't employ anybody,
yes,
can they?
Well, we forecast some bankruptcies in the February days, but in any case, the fact is that there are bankruptcies, and I'm quite sure that the government immediately will find ways and means of assisting industry, and industry surely will make its contribution.
But do you want British industry to rely wholly on government aid and not to be able to prosper in the free sector of the mixed economy?
It would be better, Robin, that they should prosper in any way they can rather than go bankrupt.
Well, it's...
Mr. O'Brien.
No, industry must be encouraged to manage its own affairs and become profitable and take its own decisions in accordance with its own market and investment needs.
Can I ask you, all the industrialists at this point, do you think it would make any difference to the climate of confidence in industry generally if there were somebody else in charge of the Department of Industry than Mr. Wedgwood Benn, or do you think that is a personality point which is overrated in conversation among industrialists? Mr. Cadbury?
I really think this is irrelevant at the moment. I mean, the situation is far too serious to be worried about long-term schemes, whether they're planning agreements or further nationalisation or whatever. The essential thing at the moment now is action. And I don't really think that whoever is in the Department of Industry is going to affect that.
Do you think the threat of nationalisation, Mr. O'Brien, is a added factor militating against confidence?
It's an added factor, and it's an irrelevancy at the moment, because all the problems are short-term and of desperate urgency, as Adrian Cadbury has said. And Richard Brigginshaw's remarks underline the crucial importance of the government getting down urgently now to talks with industry and the unions on the problems facing us. Investment, prices and incomes. Those are the three great triangles, and if you leave one of these parties out, government, industry or unions, we shall get nowhere at the end of the day. So far, we've had rather a two-party, if I may say so, element, the government and the TUC. We must have employers in.
Final comment, Ben Roberts.
But you see, the problem is, even if the social contract were 100% successful, it would be a disaster for this country, because it implies the continuance of massive inflation. This is the real problem, and it's not been tackled in this election, it's not been tackled in the social contract, but events are going to compel the government to tackle it.
Do I detect in your comment there an echo of the views of Sir Keith Joseph?
Not an echo of the views of Sir Keith Joseph, though I would go part of the way with him. I think we're inevitably going to face rising unemployment. We're inevitably going to face a further attempt by government to control the situation by damping down pay increases somehow.
But
and I don't think a Labour government is going to get off that hook.
But you're saying put in the fight against inflation before the effort to maintain what we call full employment, are you?
I think you've got to put the inflation first, because if you don't, you'll get even bigger unemployment. What is happening now is Britain is pricing herself out of the world market.
What do you say to that view, Mr. Breach, briefly?
It's not true. Our wage rates are cheaper, lower, unfortunately, in this country than anywhere else in Europe. And the problem is unit costs. It's been before on this programme. In reducing our unit costs, it means climate, it means the propaganda with regard to national unity being put into effect in industry and all over our country.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and particularly to you, Mr. Foreman, for not allowing me to give a mistaken impression about what has been going on in Northern Ireland. I'm much obliged to you, and you, Mr. Cadbury, also in Birmingham. Alistair?
Mr. Powell's result to come from South Down, and also the recount in Berwick-upon-Tweed, but some recounts have now been concluded, as you've seen the headlines while that conversation went on. First, Bosworth. Adam Butler holds the seat against Martin Sloman.
Liberals down 6%, Labour up 4%, Conservatives up 2%, but this must be heartbreaking. The second election in a row, Bosworth has kept Mr. Sloman on edge right to the very end. His seat should have gone Labour on the swing. It has just been held off, and Adam Butler is still back again.
Well, Adam Butler, of course, is the son of Rab Butler, so he's got political blood all right, and he knows how to fight. Now, here's Nick Fairbairn, who's rather a maverick and some say an eccentric advocate in Edinburgh. He's a flashy dresser, and he's had a bit of pain in holding on to Sir Alec Douglas-Hume's old seat in Kinross.
It's very ironic. He held on by 53, which is exactly the same as the majority that the Nationalists won by in Galloway and East Dumbarton put together. A majority of 30 in Galloway and 22 in East Dumbarton. The two of the four seats they've picked up from the Conservatives.
Now, it's very likely there, David, that the Liberal cost the Nationalists the seat. And here's Antrim South, Mr. James Molyneux. Well, he would feel rather naked and unprotected if he didn't have a majority of over 35,000.
He pushed up his share of the vote by 4%.
So we have still to hear from Southdown and Mr. Powell and his wife waiting at the count. This is a long count. It's not a surprise, of course, because these are big constituencies, and indeed one of the complaints made by the United Ulster Unionists and, of course, by Mr. Powell himself is that Northern Ireland deserves more seats, which would mean, of course, shorter counts. However, they mean that very much more seriously, and it's an interesting question whether Mr. Powell can hold the United Ulster Unionists in agreement that it is full integration with Britain that matters. There are those there who would wish perhaps to set up some form of semi-dominion status, with Mr. Paisley being rather a maverick and switching from one side to another. Mr. Wilson we are waiting for to come, and we've been hoping to get a statement from him in the course of the afternoon about his intentions. He has still to speak, and of his ministers, only Mr. Robert Mellish has actually said on this programme this morning that he really does want a new job. One of Mr. Wilson's preoccupations, especially in the light of the conversations we just had with industrialists and union leaders, is the budget that Mr. Dennis Healey must now bring in next month. Mr. Healey has indicated that he wants to help industry in that budget, but in what way is not sure. Does he mean to reflate the economy, or will he have to take some part of a leaf out of Sir Keith Joseph's book, which Labour has, of course, attacked so strongly during the election?
That 319 figure for the Labour Party, one should stress, is absolutely final. There are no seats still to come which could affect that. Labour will have 319 seats instead of 635 seats. That means that 316 seats will go to all other parties put together. So Labour will definitely have an overall majority of 3 over all other parties.
Now, I said Mr. Wilson is still to speak. Of course, there's been a completely severe silence all day from Mr. Heath. Loyal declarations have come from his colleagues, and there has been no public criticism, even under rather severe prompting of his campaign. Mr. Thorpe, we heard from early on, he seemed to me to be a little bit harried, and he made much, of course, of the discrepancy between seats and votes. Well, the election may be over, but of course the bookmaking business must go on, and I understand that the odds are already out on the next election. Labour are put as 6-4 on. That's to say you have to put £6 down to win £4 on the next election. Conservatives even money. You get £1 back for £1 down. And if you like to invest a judicious £1 or so on the Liberals, well, you get odds of 100 to 1 if Mr. Jeremy Thorpe were indeed to come through next time. And I also think that some odds have been opened on who the next Tory is, assuming that Mr. Heath is going to give it up. This I don't think is particularly informed political comment, but it may be somebody taking a view, or it may actually be that the money is arriving. Mr. Whitelaw seems to be odds on there. 5-4 against. Mr. Carr, second, 7-4 against. Mr. Keith Joseph, 7-2. And Mr. Peter Walker and Mr. Jim Pryor are bustling up the front 3, and Mrs. Thatcher is still quite an outsider at 50-1. And I just wonder whether Bob Mackenzie, who has indeed been mentioning Mrs. Thatcher favourably on this programme, those odds don't seem to reflect your view, Bob. Perhaps you could get a bit down.
No, what I think is interesting, though, that she is considered to be in the running, and it will be the first time in the history of these islands that a woman would ever be considered to be in the running for an office of that kind.
Would you offer any other horses? I was rather struck by that. I wonder, I mean, somebody like Edward Buchanan is a possible character who some people might have put in as an outsider. I would have thought there were 1 or 2 other outsiders who could start in that race.
Oh, yes.
Nobody put E. Powell down in that race either.
Well, he's been voting Labour in the last 2 elections. It would be a little odd if he then was elected leader of the Conservative Party.
Well, I think it would be very difficult. He rather does see himself as a leader of national unity, doesn't he?
I presume ultimately
a Churchillian reserve.
Yes, a Churchillian role, not trying to get in the sordid struggle for power in the short run for the Conservative Party, but standing outside, waiting for the nation on its knees to ask him to take over the leadership.
What I do find interesting, again, in that list is the assumption that Mr. Heath will go. One of the possibilities is that he might submit himself for re-election if the situation went
Baldwin
on
did that twice, you know, wanting to confirm his leadership and thinking it was foolish to just stay on. He twice submitted himself to a meeting to confirm his leadership. So there is that precedent.
Again, the thought must be in the minds of Mr. Heath and some of his close colleagues that, as Mr. Whitelaw said, it is a question of what the truth is going to be. Who was speaking the truth in the election? Supposing what Mr. Heath said were to come about, would not the country turn to him again, perhaps again in some form of coalition? So these must all be thoughts going through. Now, Mr. David Steele has held on in Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles. Mr. Steele, the Liberal whip, he's done much more active campaigning outside his constituency this time. He's still a young man, the young David, Mr. Thorpe called him when he visited there to help him in this election. Mr. Steele back, and of course that's a reverse for the Conservatives and the Scottish National Party, but it's been some time since Roxburgh was quite as marginal as it was when Mr. Steele first won it.
And for most of my adult life, the Liberals have not been in double figures. There have only been 2 elections since 1945 when they have got into double figures. They are in double figures now, and they certainly hope to win Orkney and Inverness, though they must be a bit pessimistic by the news that it was Alan Beath who asked for that recount in Berwick, which is the only English result we're still waiting for.
Now for Southdown again, where we are still awaiting the result.
Well, we're expecting the Southdown result in just about a quarter of an hour. At the moment, it looks perhaps a little more of a tighter race than had been expected. Behind me, they're just counting the stacks of ballot papers, and the stacks for Mr. Powell and his main rival, SDLP candidate Sean Hollywood, are fairly equal. Of course, batches of bundles can look deceptive, but still Mr. Powell is, of course, very much the favourite to win in Southdown, now perhaps between about 5,000, the previous majority, and 7,000 as earlier expected. He is, of course, expected to take Southdown, while his leader, the United Unionist leader, Harry West, is not so much favoured in Fermanagh, South Tyrone. So the next result from Northern Ireland is almost certain to be Southdown, to see what happens to Enoch Powell.
There's one party leader that we haven't mentioned in the course of this election, and it is a neglect on our part, and that is Mr. Donald Stewart, who is the leader of the Scottish National Party in the House of Commons. We had a word with Mr. William Woolf, who of course is the active leader on the ground in Scotland, and we've also seen Mrs. Winifred Ewing. But the leader actually sits for the Western Isles, which is a seat which was Labour until 1970. He is, of course, extremely comfortably ensconced there. He has been a Provost of Stornoway. He may indeed still be Provost of Stornoway, but he, no doubt, may come up for election at the start of the new Parliament. And we have him, and I think now is a chance for Robin to talk to one of those Butler form outsiders for the Conservative leadership, Mr. Edward Buchan.
I wonder, just before I go to Edward Buchan, owing to circumstances beyond my control, I didn't quite hear what David Butler said about him. Could you remind Mr. Buchan and myself?
Well, Major Butler, who is the famous tipster, said that he was rather surprised at the bookies' odds, and there must be one or two other names should come into the list, and he mentioned this promising horse.
And David Butler thinks Edward Buchan is a possible leader of the Conservative Party.
I just saw Mr. Buchan on the screen on the preview, and I saw Mr. Powell on the preview. I have heard their names mentioned, and I was just teasing Alistair to see whether he would like to bring them into the race and mention them or any other outsiders.
Mr. Buchan, have you ever heard such rubbish in all your life?
No, never. I'm not a horse in this race. But, Robin, if you want to make some money, and if the country wants to make some money...
Well, I'd like to make as much as you, Mr. Buchan.
Well, my advice would be to put money on the Conservative Party for the next election, because we shall start the business of rebuilding and organising ourselves as we did after the defeat of 1966, as you, with your encyclopedic memory, will recall, immediately.
Well,
and we shall... what?
Flattery will get you some of the way, but not all the way, Mr. Buchan. When do you think that next election is going to be? Because Mr. Robert Mellish told Mr. Wilson on the television this morning not to have one for 3 or 4 years.
Well, I think that's probably what will happen. My judgment, the parliamentary situation, is that, alas, I say as a strong Conservative, one who has the deepest feelings about what I regard as the fundamental issues at this last election, 3 or 4, whatever the figure may be, is indeed a working majority.
Would you agree with my hunch, Mr. Buchan, that the Conservative MPs will retain Mr. Heath as leader for the foreseeable future, because there's nobody else of his calibre, whatever may be his shortcomings, in Parliament, on their side?
Well, I think that's better than a hunch. I think that's an informed judgment, yes.
Do you think that he will or should? You were chairman of the 1922 committee, a very important position in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Do you think that he will or should submit himself to re-election?
Well, if I were him, I'd certainly come to no decision about a matter of that sort immediately. There is plenty of time. I'm rather opposed to instant judgments and instant actions. We get a little bit too much in that frame of mind these days.
Yes. May I just ask you a question which I put you early on before the result was clear?
Yes.
We've got to go to a declaration at Berwick-on-Tweed, Mr. Buchan, and interesting though your talk is, that is even more interesting.
I, Alfred G.A. Groom, being the acting returning officer for the Berwick-upon-Tweed constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows: Charles Addison Fitzherbert Baker Creswell,
Conservative,
14,611. Alan James Beath,
Liberal,
14,684. Gerald Thomas Preston Spain,
Labour,
4,768. And that Alan James Beath has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency.
Berwick-on-Tweed has replaced Peterborough and Ipswich as the super-marginal. There's a third time in a row a recount. Each time Mr. Beath has been elected for the Liberals.
The Liberals can be guaranteed, I think now, 13 seats in the next Parliament if they hold Inverness and Orkney, which on the present form they should do, and that means I think they're bound to be ahead of the Scottish Nationalists, who will have 11 or 12 seats in the next Parliament.
Well, although we couldn't get a very good picture, I think, from Berwick, we were with them in spirit and in sound. Alan Beath, a lecturer at Newcastle University, he won the by-election in '73, he hung on, and he will perhaps continue as the Liberal Party Home Affairs spokesman, including the problems of Northern Ireland. And let's have a look at David Steele's result, the neighbouring constituency where the Liberal whip... Oh, here's Alan Beath's result, and here is David Steele's result in Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles.
Biggest percentage majority, but the Scottish National Party, which was the lowest vote anywhere in Roxburgh last time, 8%, have jumped to 20%. But still, David Steele is very safely there, even if his majority is down by 1,700.
I think, Robin, we could continue now with Mr. Ducan, please.
Mr. Ducan, what do you think about that, if you'd like to try your hand at political commentating?
Well, I don't think I'd do it as well as some of the people whom we've all had the pleasure of watching.
I don't know about that.
It's a disappointment, obviously. I'd hoped we were going to win Berwick. Sorry we haven't done. If we haven't done it this time, we shall do it next time.
What do you think about the general effect of the Liberal, and I won't say intervention, which is a word that some people slip into rather improperly because they've every right to stand in a campaign, the Liberal campaign. What do you think the effect is that has been? Because David Butler suggests there's no evidence that it's helped the Labour Party any more than the Tories.
No, I'd like to do a careful analysis. You know, Robin, if you're standing yourself as a candidate, you have no chance even to begin to do this. I'd like to do a careful analysis and come to a conclusion later. I think many of us, before the election began on the Conservative side, were very much afraid that Liberal intervention was going to damage us. I don't think it has done to the extent, at any rate, that some of us feared.
Could I ask you what I think is probably going to be the most critical political question over the next few months? What is going to be the strategy of the Conservative Party in Parliament? Because obviously public opinion won't take kindly to another general election if an opportunity should arise, though it may not be likely in this situation, for the Conservative Party to help to bring down a government.
But equally, many of us take the view that this is a very left-wing government. And I believe that it has no intention of mitigating those particular programmes and policies which accord with its left-wing views.
Don't you think that? Don't you think on that this result will strengthen the influence of the so-called moderates, such as Mr. Prentice and Mr. Jenkins, etc., as it were, to put their cause more strongly in the governing council?
Marginally only. It's not going to have a very serious effect, in my view. I've watched the composition of the Labour Party in the House of Commons change over the 18 years that I've been there. It's very much more left-wing than ever it was. You don't have any more great trade union leaders on the Labour side in the House of Commons of the sort who would exercise a steadying influence, any more than it's any longer the party of the working man. It's the party of the extremist, the intellectual. These are the people who are continuously in the ascendancy. No, I don't think it's going to be a moderate party. So you say, what are we going to do on the Conservative side?
Yes.
We shall oppose socialist measures strongly, and I think that we shall have the total support of the country in that regard.
Can I just ask you one question? Mr. Thorpe said a very interesting matter which was to be watched was what the Conservative Party would going to say in the coming months about a political system which gives about 11 or 12 seats to the Liberals, who have got 5.25 million votes. Now, do you, Mr. Ducan, think that is fair, even though the available alternatives may not be perfect?
Well, I think Mr. Thorpe will spend a lot of time probably talking about matters of this sort. Personally, we shall be concentrating much more on the immediate problems of the economy, the Constitution and so on. But what ought we to do about this? Question really, Robin.
Here is Mr. Harold Wilson coming out of Downing Street. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Ducan, the Prime Minister of Downing Street. Of course, he doesn't have to go to the palace to get appointed Prime Minister or anything like that. And he's getting into his car, and I think he's going back to Transport House for a victory party and to say hello to his colleagues and all the people who've helped him. There's Joe Haynes there, the press secretary in Downing Street, and the Prime Ministerial rover goes down into Whitehall to go round the corner, round Parliament Square, past quite a large crowd, just in front of the Foreign Office there. They'll turn right, past the barrier, into Parliament Square and thence to Smith Square, the centre of all the press conference activity of the two main parties in this election. And I think that's all we see of Mr. Wilson now, but we'll see Mr. Wilson in about 3 or 4 minutes. So, Mr. Dukan, if it's not too humiliating a role for me, will you fill in while we can't see Mr. Wilson?
No, of course I'll. Not a humiliating role at all. Mr. Wilson is the most accomplished politician of our generation, and though I'm sorry to see that it's not Mr. Heath in Downing Street, nonetheless, one must take one's place as the cards are dealt. I have no complaint about that.
You're very kind, Mr. Dukan. Thank you. I'm going, however, to Alistair Burnett.
And with the news that the United Ulster Unionists have held Londonderry, as Mr. William Ross, not the Scottish one, this is the Ulster one, they've held Londonderry. And we saw Mr. Wilson coming out from number 10 Downing Street. As to the manner born, Bob?
Well, I'd like to make 2 points about his position. It seems to me, first of all, that it's rather misleading to talk as we do of an overall majority of perhaps 3 seats. In practice, there are very few issues, I think, where all the opposition groups will come together to try to throw him out. And if, for example, he is as skillful as Asquith was in getting the Irish nationalists to help him when he had a minority government, no overall majority after 1910, I see no reason why a generous pledge to devolution and so on wouldn't carry the Nats along most of the time, because they've nothing to gain by getting the Conservatives back in power with a far more ungenerous concession as far as they're concerned in the form of devolution. So I think you'll find that and then the Irish are preoccupied and won't be in Westminster a large part of the time. I think you'll find that the vote he gets in the House in a whole range of votes will be 10, 15, 20 majority with either abstentions or people supporting him on particular issues. So that the picture of a tottering government with a tiny, tiny majority I don't think will be the reality.
Oh, I would entirely agree with you, but I think you might just be pushing it a little bit far, mightn't you, in saying there might be any kind of open coalition with the Scottish nationalists.
There's no such coalition with the Irish.
No, but there are divisions inside the Labour Party, as you know, about the position about the SNP, and I suppose, Mr. Wisway, but certainly the way in which the splintering of the opposition must obviously make his position a very much easier one than, as you were saying, 10 years ago in 1964.
Yes.
Michael Steed, I think, has got a comment. Michael?
I've been looking at the Scottish votes cast because they are really very interesting. Labour has a clear overall majority of the seats in Scotland, 41 out of 71, but it is probably going to end up with barely 36% of the Scottish votes cast. The Nationalists have come in a very good second in Scotland in votes. They're going to end up with over 30%. They will certainly, we think, have 11 seats. If they take Ross and Cromarty, they will have 12. But they are only the third party in seats, because the Conservatives will get 15, and perhaps if they keep Ross and Cromarty, 16. But the Conservatives in votes are at least 6% behind the Scottish Nationalists. They will certainly have less than a quarter of the votes cast. Now, these figures are not going to be part of an academic debate about electoral reform. I think when Bob Mackenzie and I have mentioned proportional representation, we've been acting as academics. It's not going to be a live issue for the British Parliament in this Parliament. But in Scotland, it will be a live political issue. Labour has promised to introduce legislation for electing a Scottish Assembly. A Royal Commission has unanimously recommended a proportional representation system for that election. These figures in Scotland, where the second party in votes is third in seats, where a party has a clear overall majority of seats for only just over a third of the votes, these figures probably will be quoted in the debate about how to choose, how to vote in a Scottish Assembly.
And the man who's principally concerned there, Mr. Wilson, greeted again by Mr. Ron Hayward at the steps of number 10. Mrs. Wilson coming in first. Here they come to the victory celebration. And the applause of the Labour supporters, Mr. Wilson smiling, confident. This is the kind of party he's getting accustomed to. As you can see, his landlords, the Transport and General Workers Union, keep their plate up in the hall. But, of course, it has also been the support of Mr. Jack Jones of the Transport and General Workers, who has helped so much in Mr. Wilson's campaign and his dealings with the trade unions through the social contract. Keith Graves is down there. Keith?
Mr. Wilson's just coming in. There you are. We're in the crowded hall now, where about 200 of the workers who've been working behind the scenes here at Transport House are just having a snack lunch and a drink and waiting for Mr. Wilson to arrive. And here he comes, accompanied by Ron Hayward, the General Secretary. He's going to address a few words, I think, to the workers. before he moves
the
amongst
Prime
them.
Minister will first say a few words to you.
Nearly didn't say anything at all there.
That's the first slip he's made in this general election campaign.
Well, Ron and colleagues, first of all, may I say I'm glad that we fought the election on a better platform than this. More secure and more lasting. But the first thing I want to do is to thank all of you for the tremendous job you did right through the election, and for many of you in the months before the election began. In February, I was able to say with absolute truth that I'd never seen an election better run and better worked for than the one we had earlier in the year. But I think, though I wouldn't have thought it possible, that your efforts and the ingenuity and the organization and the fresh attack on problems, I think, transcended even what we had seen in February. Now, I want to say just one or two words, and since this may get outside, I thought I would just have a note or two. I'd like to refer now to the results which are now reaching a conclusion. There have been a few cliff-hanging recounts where I think we've been rather unlucky in a large number of cases, but then last night itself was a cliffhanger. We would, of course, have liked a bigger majority, but not everyone yet has realized that this parliamentary situation is not only challenging and interesting, but is viable and can endure until this government has completed the job it was elected yesterday to do. I say this for two reasons. First, there is no common denominator between the various parties and groupings who will be facing us. They can unite on nothing, and any of them who, for factious purposes, tries to work for the defeat of the government would know that they were risking an election which the country clearly does not want and in which they would be decisively rejected. The second reason is that a putative coalition of oppositions would have to be led, and after two successive and indeed accumulating defeats in a year, the Conservatives do not possess the authority to lead it. A general election, however necessary, is inevitably divisive because it is a choice between conflicting political parties and policies. And now, as the echoes of the hustings die away, it is manifestly essential in the wider national interest that Parliament should now give a lead to the country. For whatever has divided us in this keenly fought election campaign, we have all agreed that Britain faces, and has indeed for a considerable time been facing, the gravest economic crisis since the war. And everyone in industry and in our wider national family now needs to work together, sharing the effort and sharing the burdens of Britain's economic fight. On Monday, I hope to make a ministerial broadcast expressing to all our people, however they may have voted, whatever their political affiliations or those of no political affiliations, what, in the view of the government, must now be done in order to put the country right again and bring us through to a real economic security and advance.
Well, those words from Mr. Wilson were obviously aimed at a wider audience than just the typists and secretaries and helpers here at Transport House. A clear warning there from Mr. Wilson to anyone in any party, including his own, one felt, who might be tempted to rock the boat, that he's going to go ahead, an uncompromising speech. He's going to go ahead, as he's said all along that he will, alone, and that he's not going to look for help from anyone outside his own party. There's a bell ringing outside, which someone says is a fire bell, but no one seems to be getting very excited. You can probably hear it ringing.
We've had a lot of sort of scares here in the past 3 weeks. A lot of bomb scares, a lot of phony alarm calls. And the Labour Party has now got a very well-oiled machine for looking into these things. As no one's getting excited in the hall here, one assumes that it's another false alarm.
Prime Minister Errol Wilson's got a government. It is a Labour government. The country wants a Labour government, and we should go on for a very long time, not forgetting from whence we came and whom we represent. Thank you very much.
A few words there of support and encouragement, as one might expect from Ron Haywood, the man who's masterminded Mr. Wilson's campaign. And we've just heard there is a bomb scare, and they're vacating the building. I see Mr. Wilson's special branch men moving in around him there, one of them with a beard, you may just have seen him, are moving in around him, and they're vacating the room. People are being asked to move out. The Prime Minister's being ushered out at the side there, I see. One assumes that he is going to be taken way out of the building altogether. Let me say that no cause really for too much alarm, because as I said a few minutes ago, these calls have been coming into Transport House quite regularly for the past 3 weeks. And so there isn't any real cause for immediate alarm. Most of the people seem to be taking their drinks and sandwiches out with them. We've lost Mr. Wilson temporarily. I assume he's being taken out the back to get him out of the building, obviously, first. But as nobody's rushing out too rapidly, one assumes it's just an anonymous phone call. There's Mrs. Wilson with her detective. Mr. Wilson surrounded by his detectives, his chief of his security group there with the beard, Superintendent Arthur Smith. And in fact, that's been cut very, very short. Mr. Wilson is being moved completely out of Transport House, and he's now being put rather rapidly in his car and got away. So an unfortunate end to Mr. Wilson's triumphant return. He was going to stay and have quite a chat with the Labour Party workers. He was also going to come and talk to us afterwards. We were going to have a chat with him. But he's being rushed away from Transport House and from Smith Square. Driving there straight in front of the Tory party headquarters, where people are waiting for Mr. Heath to arrive any minute. And there we are in the deserted room. Most of the beer untouched, and the sandwiches. I'm told that Mr. Wilson will come back when it's cleared, when the room's cleared.
Well, that is very unfortunate, breaking up Mr. Wilson's victory celebrations, but that, of course, is the kind of sick thing that sick people do. And living in the modern world, all precautions have got to be taken for everyone's sake. We are still waiting, therefore, for Mr. Wilson to speak, and we hope, as Keith Graves was saying, that some stir will happen at the other side of Smith Square, and that word will come that Mr. Heath is preparing to say something to the country. I thought that Mr. Wilson made 4 points in his short and prepared speech. He first emphasised there was no common denominator between the other parties, even if Labour were to fail to have a workable majority. He said that the coalition of oppositions would have to be led by the Conservatives, and after the past 2 elections, the Conservatives had no remaining authority. He said, however, the third, and this was meant to be the olive branch, that Parliament should itself give a lead in what he said was going to be the gravest economic crisis since the war. And he gave there his recommendation for actions of national unity, of all of us in it together. And on Monday, he said, he hoped to make a ministerial broadcast on how Labour planned to put the country right. What did you think of his brief performance there, Bob?
Well, I thought he developed exactly the point we were talking about before he came to speak there. That is, the opposition is not in a position, for a variety of reasons, effectively to hamstring this government. The opposition isn't agreed among itself, it's a very disparate group, and secondly, it wouldn't dare force an election in any capricious way. That said, I think the one thing to be kept in mind, however, is he does face certain problems in terms of the strength of support demonstrated in this election, just under 40% of those who voted on a low poll have actually willed him to take office. That means something like 30% of the total adult population got out and voted for a Labour government. Now, that doesn't mean he can't govern. That's not the way we arrive at a mandate. But he will have to move the nation in a way that clearly he didn't in terms of rallying popular support at this election.
And, of course, in certain parts of the nation, say as in Scotland, his proportion of the vote is even lower.
Yes.
David, do you think that a government needs nowadays the moral authority of more votes than perhaps was required in the 20s?
I think the votes argument will be used. I frankly don't think it's tremendously important any more than it was important to Sir Winston Churchill in 51 that the Labour Party had more votes than the Conservatives. It didn't destroy the Conservatives' authority to govern. So, it's an academic sort of point. But at the same time...
Sorry, is it really that academic? Because now the middle party of the Liberals, which was a very small party in those days, maybe 2 million, 3 million votes, now has virtually doubled in size in the country, and it does now have an even more burning grievance because of this.
I think that's true, but I think what's really rather more important is that his majority is so small that if times get rough, and we're quite clear that they are going to be extremely rough, and the public may be understanding, we get wonderful leadership from the Labour Party, but I suspect that under the pressures of taxes and inflation over the next year, and hardship and possible unemployment unavoidable during the winter, that there will in fact be a turn against the government before long, which will be shown in by-elections, and it's going to make life very difficult to give really strong government without an eye on the electorate of the sort we've had. It won't be as bad as it's been over the last 6 months with the general election pending, but the possibility of a general election being forced on the government is there. And it's there also, I think, with the Scottish nationalists, who this election has shown are on a jumping-off ground to go to much bigger heights than the 11 or 12 seats they're now looking like.
Here's Mr. Heath now coming, and this is the first sight that we have had of the Leader of the Opposition. Saying nothing to the reporters at the door, he goes inside the building. No doubt he will be having a discussion with his friends and colleagues there, and no doubt he too will be having a word with the workers for his party, the disappointed party this time, on the other side of Smith Square from Transport House. Well, that was Mr. Heath. We have had a report, I don't know if it's official yet, that in fact Mr. Enoch Powell has been elected in Southdown, that seat that we have been watching, but I understand that it is still unofficial. And of course, David, Mr. Powell did have rather a worried look at his face.
I couldn't help feeling that. It looked almost, I think he was just actually checking his speech with his wife. He had that worried look one tries to deduce. We've often enough had camera shots on by-election nights or before a count, and one guesses. The answer is secret until the returning officer declares it. One tries to make one's guess from their faces. One's usually right. If I just had to make a guess from Mr. Powell's face and know nothing about him, I'd have guessed that he'd lost, but I'm pretty sure he's won.
And that was a glimpse of the count, so that the view which we have given is unofficial, and I have no doubt one could get into terrible trouble if one were, in fact, to jump the gun on any returning officer. Returning officers have their pride. Now, have we any results? And here's the Londonderry result. That is Mr. William Ross, one of Mr. Powell's colleagues, we imagine, in the group of loyalists coming from Northern Ireland to Westminster after this election.
And this is the least good result they've had. The only goes up 2%, and the John Hume, well known, goes up 3% for the SDLP. It is the one thing where the swing has been to the SDLP and not to the Ulster Unionists.
And here's Armagh. This very much an Ulster Unionist stronghold. The two seats, just to remind you, that we're really waiting for after Southdown are Mid-Ulster and Fermanagh and Tyrone, where there is a possibility.
2% swing to the Ulster Unionists in Armagh.
In Fermanagh, South Tyrone, and also in Mid-Ulster, possibility of seats changing hands in Northern Ireland. Now, Mr. Heath, of course, I don't suppose he's going to make any really public pronouncement until he has talked over his position, perhaps made a few phone calls and cleared the line, possibly of masterly inactivity with some of his closest advisers. David, do you think?
I don't think we shall see much real activity. I think he has to appear, has to thank his supporters today, but I should be very surprised if anything is said. Mr. Heath is a person who moves rather slowly on things. He was slow about making his decision to hold an election in January. He's slow about difficult and critical decisions about appointing people. He's a strong leader, but he's slow in making decisions. I wouldn't expect any instant action, any
sharp statement today.
And certainly everything that's been said in the Conservative Party, including by some of the people that he perhaps hasn't seen eye to in the past, like Mr. Edward Buchanan, whom Robin Day was talking to, they've made it easy for him to make up his own mind and to act at his own pace. And let's see, Brian Walker at Southdown, have you any news for us?
Well, here at Southdown, there is some delay in the announcement of the count because there has been a slight mix-up over ballot papers. Apparently, some of Mr. Enoch Powell's papers got mixed up with that of the candidate of the SDLP party, Mr. Sean Hollywood. But we should have this result in a few moments. It does, however, look now as if Mr. Enoch Powell will not be triumphantly elected as United Unionist member for Southdown. My latest information is, it will have to be confirmed, of course, that he will be elected on a reduced United Unionist majority, although the poll was up by some 5%. So last week he said, I told an audience, I'm Ulster now. We are now waiting to see whether the voters agree with him. It looks as if they will, but perhaps not as enthusiastically as he and the United Ulster Unionists might have hoped.
And that may well be evidence of the existence in Southdown of a strong body of moderate opinion on the Protestant side and also on the Catholic side, which gave such very big returns to Mr. Brian Faulkner in this part of the country in the Northern Ireland Assembly election.
But it might be something quite different. Mr. Powell said vote Labour, and this would offend some traditional unionists in that area. Indeed, as I looked at the figures above your head, those 319 seats, here's a very close fought election. It's full of if-onlys. Possibly Mr. Powell, if he has any influence in England, for the third election in a row, may have had a decisive influence on the outcome. He said vote Conservative at the last moment in 1970. He said vote Labour, and may surely have tipped some seats in February, and he did it again this time, and I think his influence has diminished, but it still could have been the difference between 319 and, say, 315 seats.
But you see, David, also in the if-only department, it's as back in February. If, in fact, Mr. Heath had not shut down the Stormont and brought in power sharing against the wishes of those Ulster Unionists who didn't like power sharing, of course the Conservatives would have been the largest single party back in February because those Ulster Unionist votes would be in their side of the column, and now Labour would not have a clear overall majority.
Those are only the beginnings of the if-onlys that I've got to chronicle over the next 6 months, I think.
Yes, your publications are coming thick and fast. I hope you're making an early start on this one. We'll go back to Southdown just as soon as we get any real indication that the result can be clarified. A look at the Northern Ireland seats so far, and starting in Belfast, we have 3 going straight away to the United Ulster Unionist Council, or coalition there, of all the loyalists, and only Belfast West going as it normally does nowadays to Mr. Gerry Fitt of the SDLP. Mr. Gerry Fitt, who sat in the power-sharing executive. Going north into strong Protestant country, Antrim North and South Paisley country, again the loyalists running well, and in North Down piling up very big majorities indeed. Not too good a result for them in Londonderry, although Mr. William Ross safely back there against Mr. John Hume, and Mr. McCusker doing well, as one would have expected in the Loyalist cause in Armagh. And now what is shaping up are the 2 seats which are normally held in the old days, perhaps even by nationalists, certainly by a Catholic majority out west beyond the Bann. Bob, have you any further views about the share of the vote?
Yes, let's have a look at it again, if we may, the share of the vote board. Reading across the top there, Labour is now under the 40% mark, and by the present projections is unlikely to return to 40%. And now there's a slight psychological disadvantage in slipping below 40%. Keep in mind that's the smallest share of the vote that any majority government had had for 50 years. The Conservatives obviously crept up a little bit, second figure in, because these are Conservative seats that have been reporting mainly on the second day. Liberals still running slightly more than half as many votes as the Conservatives and almost half as many votes as the Labour Party. Again, the source of their grievance against the electoral system yet again. Others having strengthened their position by about 1% in these seats, with it still something like, 8 seats to come? No, can't count anymore. Anyhow, 635 altogether.
But Bob, isn't it also remarkable that the great Conservative Party, party of national government, national unity, that was the appeal that was made, it is now down to 36%, just a little over, really over a third of the country responding.
You have to go way back in history to find that situation too, and obviously it's the fact that roughly a quarter of the electorate is again voting for third and fourth parties in this country.
Now, if we did, as they do in some other democracies, and actually included those who abstained as serious people, people who are qualified to vote but actually abstained. In France, they reckon that's as good as casting a vote, and it is recorded. We really are getting down now, aren't we, to a situation which the major parties do appear to have fallen on quite hard times.
With Labour, about 30% of those who could have voted Labour on this occasion, and Tories slightly under that as well, so that we have a curiously fractionalised electorate. I think when you say 72% turnout, perhaps 5%, 8% or 10% couldn't vote for one family or illness reason or whatever, but still non-voting was on a large scale. Perhaps, indeed, the public opinion polls have something again to answer for. There have been a lot of people who would have voted Labour possibly if they hadn't thought it was in the bag on the day. So that I think on balance it has its disturbing aspects for a government facing the kind of problems this one does.
Well, does it not reflect something which is also said? And having been bound up in the election campaign and the results, perhaps we're not inclined to see it. But some people say that this is really a farce which is being enacted now, that the House of Commons is being carried on in the Palace of Westminster and all the forms are being gone through. But that in fact this is not an election that matters, that it is the relationship of the new government, of whichever party it is, with the trade unions, which now matters in this country. That the power has moved away from the men who have been elected here today, whether they're in the government or in the opposition, whether they're backbenchers or frontbenchers. And that the power in Britain has moved away from Parliament, from this institution, and all this equipment and gear and all the campaign and all the money that has been spent.
This is the golden age myth. People always say Parliament's not what it is. We've always been governed by civil servants doing a large amount of routine, but I refuse to believe it makes no difference whether we have Heath and his men or Wilson and his men there. I think it makes much less difference than many people allow. They will do many of the same things because they have no option. But I do think the history of Britain would be very different if different men had been elected to the leaderships of the Conservative and Labour parties 10 years ago, or if the outcome of the 1970 or the February election had been different. It really would have been a different scene. I can't say exactly how it would have been, but I don't think we would be sitting here in exactly the same way as we are now.
But I think that is my point, David, that if decisions had been taken at that time in another way, it might well be that we wouldn't be discussing, as I think many people do discuss quite seriously, the diminution of the power of Parliament, whether it's gone to the civil service for a while, whether it has now gone away to the trade unions, as many people would suggest.
But was it ever there? I mean, this is my challenge to you. I think this is the golden age myth. I remember Ted Heath making speeches when he was Chief Whip, which he teased people by citing what a Chief Whip had said in 1896 about how Parliament was not what it was. People go on saying that. I think it gets more difficult to manage things because government is expected to do more things. It's more difficult to manipulate.
Myths are myths, and myths are quite important in people's lives. Myths contribute, for example, to respect, and respect is engendered by the behaviour of institutions. If, in fact, what you are saying is that the British people are now discovering what has always been the reality, I would not go against you.
But could you add this one thing?
You are not going against me.
I'm not going against you, except I think that people are expecting more of government now than they were, and therefore they're more readily disappointed. But I don't think the actual power of government to affect the lives of people has diminished. The actual power of Parliament. I think my life is probably a great deal more influenced by what Parliament says and does than my grandfather's was.
The one thing to be added, though, too, is that Mr. Heath, before this present government, went further than any previous Prime Minister ever had in trying to get a tripartite relationship between government, business and the trade unions, and almost invited them into an arrangement to, as it were, oversee the economy. And now he talks about televising a large version of Neddy and so on. So there is a sense in which what you said does have an element of truth, that there is now a recognition all round that you can't settle things in Parliament alone. You must have some kind of meeting with the great interests in the community. The social contract, which Mr. Wilson clearly wants to expand to include full business participation, seems to me to illustrate this.
Very well. Now we've defended Parliament all the way from the constitutional responsibility of ministers down to the swingometer, and I'm sure it'll be in operation for many elections to come.
I noticed, by the way, there are 8 seats to come, and leaving out South Down, Orkney and Shetland,
The other 6 are all seats that have changed hands in the last 10 years. In other words, we do have this, when we have cliff-hanging elections, they spread on through the afternoon. When almost all the results are in, you might think it was a foregone conclusion, and yet we still have seats which really could go either way, which have gone either way within the last decade, within the last 4 elections.
Now, is that what some people call the periphery effect, that there is, the further away you get from London, the more people get a bit narky about the two-party system and government, and so you do find some interesting results, say, for example, in the crofting counties and elsewhere?
I think that is very largely the explanation. I think you get much more individual and eccentric results there, much less of the national swing, because the main lesson of tonight's results to me is, on the whole, of uniform national behaviour. There is remarkable similarity right across the country in the fall in turnout, in the swing, in the drop in the Liberal vote, in every city, in every county across England, and to a large extent across Wales. Scotland has been rather different because of the presence of the Scottish nationalists and their upsurge.
Well, now, at this time we have been hoping to have an interview with Sir Alec Douglas-Home, of course the former Conservative Prime Minister, who is stepping out of the House of Commons now to retire. And as soon as we hear that he's available, we'll hope that Robin will be able to talk to him. We are also waiting, as we were saying, for the South Down result, and Mr. Enoch Powell is clearly waiting there too. It's been a long day, a long wait for him. And here we have Sir Alec now in our Newcastle studio. Robin.
Good afternoon, Sir Alec.
Good afternoon.
Just to refer to the result in your old constituency, which you did not contest, of Kinroth and West Perthshire, may I remind you and everyone that the majority for the Conservatives was 53, as opposed to your 8,000. Now, was that due entirely to your not being there, or to other factors?
I think other factors. It's rather strange that there should be this swing away from the Conservatives in the agricultural areas of Scotland, because actually we were the first party who had to put forward a scheme for devolution. We did it 5 years ago. I dare say we didn't remind the public enough of it, but it was very carefully worked out.
Clearly, though, your idea of a non-elected assembly, which fell far short of Kilbrandon's majority recommendation and didn't commend itself to people, did it?
Well, I doubt if they ever got down to really considering the details of an assembly, whether it should be indirectly elected or elected. It didn't really, curiously enough, I've been in quite a number of Scottish constituencies, didn't play a great part, the actual constitution of the assembly. What did play a part was whether it was the separation from England or whether it was to be some form of devolution. And here on the separation from England, of course, it is true that the Scottish nationalist leaders, I think, as opposed to a good many of the rank and file, want complete separation. Now, this is going to be a great problem in the new Parliament.
Sir Alec, I don't know whether you heard Mr. Wilson's address, which was more to the nation just now than to the party workers at Transport House, but he said as the echoes of the hustings die away, Parliament must give a lead, and whatever has divided us now in what has all been agreed as the gravest economic crisis from the war, everyone now needs to work together. Now, what contribution do you think, A, the Labour government can make to that appeal, which I'm sure you agree with in principle, and what contribution do you think the opposition can make?
Well, certainly I agree with what Mr. Wilson has said, or what you tell me he said. I didn't actually hear it. If he will try and proceed by consensus, then I see no reason why we shouldn't beat the main problem, which is the inflationary problem. Of course, he turned this down when we offered it, and I think one will have to wait to see how far he's prepared to go with the other parties in order to find common ground. If he will do that, then I think we can get through our main difficulty. One other thing strikes me about his party, that's the only one of the worries I have, is they're divided on an awful lot. They're divided on Europe. I think they're divided on defence and defence expenditure. And I should be very surprised if on the plan for devolution for Scotland there isn't a acute division inside the Socialist Party when you get into the next Parliament.
You did, during the election, sorry for interrupting, Jack, you did say during the election that you warned of the damaging effects overseas of the election of an extreme socialist government in Britain, and you said it was certain to be extreme because those who believed in the Marxist philosophy would quickly take charge. Now, in the circumstances of a small majority, do you think the dangers of what you call the Marxist influence will be smaller and that the Social Democrats will feel a little stronger?
I would hope that they... I hope that they would, and I saw that John McIntosh rather forecast this, and of course he is one of the more moderate ones. Nevertheless, they will have a great trouble on their hands.
Excuse me, Sir Alec. Excuse me. We have to go to Southdown. We'll come back to you in a moment.
30,047.
That's the SDLP candidate. A very good vote there for the SDLP candidate, Mr. Sean Hollywood, putting his vote up by 5,000.
Gerard Oliver O'Hanlon, 2,327. John Enoch Powell, 33,614.
Mr. Powell, Unionist.
David Hugh Vipond,
Marxist, Leninist,
152. The undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the state constituency. John Enoch Powell.
Mr. Enoch Powell now returned to Northern Ireland, but the Unionist majority has indeed been cut.
Ladies and gentlemen, in view of the announcement which has just been made, it falls to me to make an entirely uncontroversial statement in moving a hearty vote of thanks to the Deputy Returning Officer and of all who have assisted him in any way in all parts of this election. I think it would be right that with that vote of thanks there should be associated those who have maintained order and security at the polls. To all those, all concerned, are bound to be deeply grateful. I thank the majority in this constituency who have made me their representative by their votes. But I wish to make it clear that I shall regard it as my duty to be the Member of Parliament for every constituent, irrespective of how he voted and irrespective of circumstances. That is the proper function of a representative, and that is how I shall represent Southdown.
Mr. Deputy Returning Officer, there is the full result from Southdown. Mr. Enoch Powell's majority, 3,500. The previous Unionist, Captain Orr, had 5,600.
At all times with
a drop of 1.3 in the Unionist share of the vote there.
Charming. He's always been helpful. And
no, I think we should now go back to Robin Day and Sir Alec. Robin?
Sir Alec, I'm sorry we were interrupted. Have we got you there? Yes, there we are. Sorry we were interrupted. What is your comment on the return of Mr. Enoch Powell to the House of Commons, and how do you see his activities in the course of the next few months, because he is a very experienced parliamentary operator?
I think that's the last uncontroversial speech that Enoch's made made for some time. So he will be obviously a force in the next parliament, because you say he's a very, very able parliamentarian. Very difficult, I think, to predict what line he will take. He's anti-nationalisation and anti-most of the socialist programme, but advise people to vote socialist.
Can you give us your guidance on the parliamentary position? Are the Ulster Unionists, the loyalists now, of which Mr. Power was one of the candidates, are they now in any kind of association with the Conservative Party anymore?
Well, they've been estranged for some time, haven't they? But that would have to be for the leader of the Conservative Party to answer as to what the relationship can be in the next Parliament. I wouldn't hazard a guess on that.
Do you think that there is any situation at all in which Mr. Powell could emerge as a leading figure, or the leading figure, on the right-hand side of the parliamentary benches?
Well, he's very much, I think, on the right-hand side, as far as I've been able to judge what he's been saying lately. No, I wouldn't have thought. Of course, you'll be a leading parliamentary performer, that is true. But I wouldn't have thought you'd find much sympathy in the ranks of the Conservative members of Parliament.
Would you say that my hunch is right, Sir Alec, that whatever criticisms may be made of Mr. Heath, the political likelihood is that he will not be moved out of his leadership of the Conservative Party, as you were after at the time you were leader?
I should say there's no reason at all why I should be moved out. We fought a united campaign, and on the whole, although we lost, I think it was a sensible campaign. We tried to forecast to the people what the future was going to look like unless it was tackled by consensus with some degree of unity. And I think it all depends, we said at the start, whether Mr. Wilson is able to produce that feeling of unity and to beat the inflation problem. Otherwise, we are in for a very, very difficult time. This is going to be a very difficult parliament for Mr. Wilson to manage, I would think. He's got a very small overall majority.
Sir Alec, you are no longer a member of Parliament, and you're no longer a House of Lords. Would you welcome a return to the House of Lords as a mere life peer, as opposed to a 14th Earl?
I think the life peers are pretty useful people. After all, they're there as working peers. But that's not for me to say if I go back to House of Lords or not. Somebody would have to invite me to do so.
Perhaps Her Majesty would use her prerogative and make you a life Marquis, perhaps, one up from what you were before.
I should lay odds against that.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Alec.
Thank you.
Douglas Hume and his questions about the future. I suppose in going out from immediately active politics, although of course Sir Alec was campaigning in the Conservative interest throughout that election, the future can be seen with great clarity. So, Mr. Powell is back, but that is quite a little reverse for him, David. Wouldn't you agree that, in fact, to have a reduced majority may very well reduce his influence inside the Ulster Unionists?
It looked like a marginal seat. After all, if you allowed for the minor parties as being anti-unionist, he just had 50.1% of the vote. It was a very close thing for him, and is in a sense snubbed. But still, he is back, and he is in Parliament. He had 24 years in Parliament. He must have felt very lonely for the last 6 months out of it. He will be a force to be reckoned with, even if he is regarded slightly as a pariah now by the Conservatives as he is by the Labour Party.
Some people have said, of course, that he must have been very desperate indeed to get back to the Parliament in order quite to tie himself so formally with the Ulster Unionists.
I think it's a gamble that hasn't really paid off in his case, because he had to demonstrate tremendous drawing power, which he hasn't really done. I mean, to have lost some of the majority for the party is not going to make him into the utterly charismatic figure that he might have thought he would become as leader, the prospect of being leader of the Ulster Unionists.
But at least he's in Parliament, so that if the catastrophe comes and a government of all the talents has to be assembled, Mr. Powell, after all, is somebody who still does have the gift of catching the ear of the British public and does have a following, and might be somebody who had to be in such a thing. I'm sure that's the sort of calculation that he or his friends may be making.
Now, might it be possible that Mr. Powell, in actually saying that they should vote Labour, is this not really going to confuse his own relationship with his own colleagues in the Ulster Unionist Party?
Well, this is in relation, of course, to one issue which, according to the Labour manifesto, is going to come up the next 12 months in the life of it will therefore be in the life of this Parliament, on having a referendum in Europe. It was simply in order to have a referendum in Europe that he said that people should vote Labour.
Very good. Bob?
Well, there are no single-issue elections, however, and I think he has gone a long way to damaging his position beyond repair with the Tory party, judging from my reactions that I've got from Tories when I've raised his name.
Well, the anecdote is told, of course, back in the days when Balfour asked Carson whether he wouldn't come into a Conservative set up as something rather more than whatever it was, Attorney General or something like that. And he said, there are other issues in Ireland, and Carson replied, yes, but Ireland is the only reason why I'm in politics. And that is true of Mr. Powell's colleagues, but not true of Mr. Powell.
And of
now
course,
then, Robin?
I could just put in a point there. I think it's true to say that Mr. Powell added another reason for voting Labour this time, not merely the common market one, but also the fact that he said the Conservative government that was last in power was the true author of Britain's inflation. And he passed that verdict on them as well. And so his charge to vote Labour was a double-barrelled one in that sense.
Do you really mean that he actually thinks that Mr. Dennis Healey will now bring in an actively deflationary policy, as Mr. Powell would recommend?
Well, it's a fat lot of use you asking me what Enoch Powell thinks about Dennis Healey, but...
I thought you were in touch with all these great names.
I am, but I think there's better things for us to do than for me to speculate on what they think.
But I think that Enoch Powell actually is in Parliament now as the true independent. I mean, he is his own man, his own particular set of views which just don't fit into any mould, let alone the Ulster Unionist mould. And when Dick Taverne and Eddie Milne have been
pushed out of Parliament. We've got Nationalists and Liberal and Labour and Conservative, and then we have Enoch Powell as a breeder politician with his own particular mix of philosophy, which just doesn't go into the ordinary party moulds, although I'm sure he still thinks that he is a Tory.
And of course, he obviously expects the apocalypse, with or without rivers of blood. And no doubt in this situation, he wants to be there in case the nation does turn to him in that situation.
Yes, he did say, I am a Tory, I shall die a Tory. That's been another of his...
He's actually a Manchester Liberal, really.
It is, well, it is one of the attributes of the prophet that he does give various differing prophecies. Now, Robin, you have some other guests.
Well, now we're coming to the question of Ulster, and I have the assistance here of Mr. T. Utley, leader writer on the Daily Telegraph, who stood himself as a Faulkner Unionist candidate against Mr. Paisley last time, I think. And also Mrs. Mary Holland of the New Statesman, who writes a lot on Northern Ireland and knows it very well. Mary Holland, your view on the Ulster result, as you see it?
Well, I think that the lowered majority of Mr. Powell has rather lowered his prestige and chances of claiming automatically the leadership of the Unionists at Westminster. However, I want to take Bob Mackenzie up on something he said 2 or 3 times, which is that Ulster MPs go to Westminster to talk about Ulster and nothing else. Mr. Powell has been saying consistently throughout this campaign, those days are over. Ulster Unionist MPs now go to Westminster to debate the affairs of the nation, as he says.
We're not going to have Ulster MPs talking about the money supply.
That is what he says. That is what he says. He is dinning into them, whether he will be able to do it, because whether he will get the leadership, but he is dinning into them that if they are to be taken seriously as a power bloc, and if they hope to negotiate with either party, they must be seen at Westminster, they must vote as a power bloc, they must support policies, presumably his policies, as a power bloc.
Do you see this result shortly as a movement away from any hope of power sharing and towards even more strong confirmation of the loyalist support in the province?
Yes, I do, particularly since Mr. Powell, has been preaching what he calls the rebuilding of the magnificent monolith of unionist unity. And, of course, the policies which he has been preaching are to overturn British government policy in Northern Ireland for the last 5 years.
Is the magnificent monolith of Protestant unity another word for the Protestants' ascendancy?
I would say that it is our people, which is what he talks about now consistently.
I see Mr. Brian Faulkner in Northern Ireland, but Mr. Faulkner, you came in halfway through the discussion. I'd just like a comment from Mr. T. Utley. Do you see this as a step away from what you were fighting for in Northern Ireland, Mr.
Well, I think the total results are certainly that, and I think that actually they're going to involve some embarrassment eventually, even to Mr. Enoch Powell, because, I mean, just let's look very briefly at what is likely to happen. I mean, what these 11 unionists...
Can I just chip in for one moment and tell you that there is a recount at Fermanagh and South Tyrone, and what do you think the significance of that is, Mr. Utley?
Well, I think the significance of that is that, as we know, Harry West may well be defeated, and of course that has
But he is the present leader of the
UUC,
yes.
And Mr. Powell would be the obvious choice as his successor.
Can I, on that, go to Mr. Brian Faulkner, the last Prime Minister of Northern Ireland before direct rule? Mr. Faulkner, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Robin.
What is your comment on that comment by Mr. Utley that Mr. Powell may emerge as the leader of the Unionists, and Mary Holland's earlier comment that because of his the diminished majority in down south, that this has somewhat hampered his prestige?
Oh, I imagine the people who brought him over here, the Paisley, Craig, West triumvirate, will be bitterly disappointed with his poor showing in South Down. Whether that'll make any difference to his sway, I would imagine there'll be a battle of personalities for leadership in that group.
I've always found in politics that on election night we say the majorities are down and so on, but after election night nobody ever gives a hoot about what majority people got, whether it was 5,000 and 6,000, so far as political influence is concerned.
You almost said a tinker's cuss there, I think. But I think in South Down they probably will remember this. I think in Northern Ireland generally they'll remember it. But of course...
Mr. Faulkner, can I interrupt? I apologise. A loyalist gain in Mid-Ulster has just come up on the screen. Your comment on that?
That this was a very touch-and-go constituency. I'm not really surprised at that result because the anti-loyalist vote, so-called, was apparently very gravely split between SDLP and other people. It's not a surprising result, but I would think that in Fermanagh South Tyrone it must be very, very close between Harry West and his
That is
opponent.
Mr. Dunlop of the Loyalist Coalition.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Faulkner, do you think that the cause you were working for in the last couple of years, that of power sharing and the Irish dimension and of the construction of bridges between the two communities, that this is now lost and we are back to what Mr. Powell calls the magnificent monolith of Protestant unity?
No, I don't believe that for one moment. I'm quite convinced that Northern Ireland will never make progress unless there's stability. And I don't believe you'll get stability unless you have some form of power sharing within the United Kingdom. But you see, this vote today has been really a border referendum in Northern Ireland. The people were just voting on a simple issue. Do they want to stay in the United Kingdom or do they want to leave it? And they shrunk from leaving the United Unionist Council candidates because they felt if they did, they would be weakening their determination to stay within the United Kingdom. I think it was as simple as that. It's a disappointing result overall, but it's not really a surprising one, and I don't really think that it has relevance to future elections in Northern Ireland, where I'm convinced the majority of the population, both Protestant and Roman Catholic, support the kind of policies that we were pursuing in the executive, namely sharing administrative responsibility in a Northern Ireland government.
Can I just ask for a comment on that first from Mary Holland?
Well, I think that Mr. Faulkner's own personal prestige in South Down probably contributed considerably to the big SDLP vote. He virtually called on his supporters to vote for the SDLP candidate. And I wonder now if he wishes that he had stood in that constituency against Mr. Powell for power sharing, for the policies that he advocated.
Did you hear that, Mr. Faulkner?
I did. I never considered standing in the constituency of South Down on this business. After all, I am the leader of a new party that's only been in operation for a few weeks. We only fielded 2 candidates in this election. And the leader of a party mustn't be expected to go out supporting the candidates of other parties either, in South Down or anywhere else. But I do believe that in that South Down result, there is a lesson for the people who thought that they could use the Powell name for victory.
Thank you very much indeed. And incidentally, there was a slight error in our announcement about Mid-Ulster. It's the Loyalist Coalition holding Mid-Ulster, according to something which has been handed to me. Is that right, Alistair?
That's right, Robin, and here is the full result which we're able to give Mr. Dunlop, and indeed, as Mr. Faulkner indicates there, a big vote for the Republican Club's candidate probably did mean that Mr. Cooper, the moderate SDLP, failed to chase up the Ulster Unionists very successfully.
The total Unionist vote is about the same. Last time it was split, this time it's united. It's about the same as last time. Mr. Cooper has put on 11% onto the SDLP vote compared to last February.
And now back to Robin, who I think has Mr. Enoch Powell down the line to Southdown.
Good afternoon, Mr. Powell.
Hello, Robin. Long time no see.
Yes, I'm sorry not to have talked to you in recent weeks. May I just ask if you recall those lines which you once quoted from Houseman? Do you feel that there has been a just use in this election of those weapons stored in the arsenals of divine vengeance?
The weapons are there all right in the arsenal, and I thought that the United Kingdom result indicated a further application of them. But so far as Southdown is concerned, the important thing is that the Unionist vote was up by between 2,000 and 3,000, showing that the process of reunification of the different strands of unionism in Northern Ireland is going ahead. That's the most important result to me.
It's been suggested here, Mr. Powell, that the reduced majority in your constituency will affect your prestige among the Ulster Loyalists and will diminish your chances of becoming their parliamentary leader.
Oh dear. Well, we shall have to see about that, shan't we?
Yes, we will indeed. What do you think is the truth of the matter?
I haven't given the question of my chances there a thought. The point is that we, the 12 of us, have fought as a single team for the second time in 1974. That is the central fact, and the increased Unionist vote in Southdown gives emphasis to it.
Mr. Powell, do you take credit, as again has been suggested here this afternoon, for perhaps being the the influential cause which, in saying vote Labour, which just tipped Labour over the line to a narrow majority?
I hope so. One can never prove these things. I hope so. And of course, from the point of view of those of us who are determined to see Britain outside the common market in its present form, this is a particularly gratifying result, since it is perfectly obvious that Labour would not be able to go on governing but for the votes of those whose sole object in voting Labour in Great Britain was to ensure that the renegotiation was carried on, the fundamental renegotiation, and that there was an eventual decision through the ballot box.
May I put to you a point which I would have put had I had a chance to do during the campaign, to suggest to you that you're a bit out of date on this point about fundamental renegotiation, because the Labour Party now is not, as many would say, fundamentally renegotiating, because Mr. Callaghan has said he is not going to renegotiate the treaties, and therefore nothing in his renegotiation can affect the parliamentary sovereignty aspects which worry you so deeply.
Well, you have to explain how he can possibly square that with the precise words of a February manifesto, which were expressly reaffirmed in the manifesto on which the Labour Party fought this election. So far as I'm concerned, I believe they are the prisoners, willing or otherwise, of those promises which undoubtedly, at the margin, have secured them the right to govern at all.
Can I put to you what Lord Hailsham said during the campaign? Mr. Powell is so intent for personal reasons on ruining Mr. Heath that no attack, however violent, however irrational, is beyond him in his present frame of mind.
Well, there's only one person who ruined Mr. Heath, and that's Mr. Heath. As I told him in the House of Commons in 1972, it is absolutely fatal to attempt to govern on principles opposite to those on which you were elected. He needs no one else to ruin him after doing that.
Do you advise the Conservative MP to choose a new leader, Mr. Powell?
I'm not going to give advice to members of another party. The United Ulster Unionists have no commitments to any other party. I'm not a member of a Conservative party. Of course, I'm a Tory, but that's a different matter. Very different matter indeed, in many respects.
Do you hope
so I'm not going to interfere in other people's business.
Do you hope to rejoin the Conservative Party? Because you once said, and have often said, I was born a Tory and will die a Tory.
Indeed, and a Tory I am, which wouldn't apply to many members of the present Conservative front bench. But the answer to your question is that I hope that the Conservative Party, in its better mind, will see the necessity and justice of the case which is being put forward by the United Ulster Unionists, and that it will be possible for them, by affirming that policy, to secure the adherence of the United Ulster Unionists, and thus to reunite or reknit what used to be a very firm and important alliance.
Finally, Mr. Powell, on your new party, Lord Hailsham said of that, Enoch has found another cause to betray. What is your comment on that?
I leave people to judge for themselves, though I do not think their judgment generally agrees with that of Lord Hailsham.
Would you just hold one moment, Mr. Powell, because I have Lord O'Neill of the Main here, a former Unionist Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and I wondered if he would like to make a comment to Mr. Powell, and in particular Mr. Powell's reported reference to the magnificent monolith of Protestant unity.
Did I say that? Did I use the word Protestant? You have inserted the word Protestant into what I said, which is an example of the I know it was unintentional on your part.
I apologise, Mr. Powell. Tell us what you did say. I didn't do it intentionally. I understood that was what you said.
No, but that's what's significant, in that I, not having used the word Protestant at all, you thought you were reporting me correctly when you inserted it. I said that the increased unionist vote, the increased vote for the UUU candidate, as compared even with February, between 2,000 and 3,000, showed that the reknitting of the strands of union in this province is going ahead. That's what I said.
What did you say it was a magnificent monolith of?
I don't remember using the word monolith. I think it must be yours.
Mary Holland corrects me, and is on your side on this point, that you said the magnificent monolith of unionist unity.
In a rally at the Ulster Hall.
In a rally at the Ulster Hall.
Oh, I see.
Penny has dropped, has it?
Oh, yes. Well, I would like to see it. Indeed, a monolith. I would like to see these strands so closely reunited that it would be no exaggeration to describe their unity as monolithic. I thought you were misunderstanding once again what I'd said this afternoon.
No, I'm glad you corrected me on the language, because we have a duty to get it right. But hold on for Lord O'Neill, who I think would like to make a comment to you about your attitude in Ulster.
Well, I'm not going to make a comment about his attitude, but I am gratified to see that he got a lower majority, a lower majority than Willie Orr, who for many years was the MP but didn't live there and latterly very seldom went there.
Why are you gratified? Do you think Mr. Powell is a force for evil in Ulster?
Well, I regret very much what Mr. Powell stands for. And whatever he may or may not have said about the shipyard, I'm perfectly sure that Mr. Powell is not in favour of regional development in the way that I was when I was Prime Minister and brought in new industry.
What about that, Mr. Powell?
I should have thought that what Lord O'Neill has said is evidence of his own bitter and frustrated state of mind. I can well understand that. But that for a former Ulster Prime Minister to regret the signs of Ulster unionism being reunited does seem to me to be the ultimate in self-contradiction.
Well, in my day, the Unionist Party was a very much more moderate party than the members with whom Mr. Powell is now associated.
And look what happened.
Well, if we're not going to have moderation, then we risk having civil war, and I, at least, will not be responsible for that.
And can I just put one point to you, Lord O'Neill? Do you not see that on a democratic basis, perhaps 50–60% of the vote in Northern Ireland have again rejected the cause of power sharing? And when a democracy does that, how can people, for whatever reason, force something down their throat which they don't want?
Oh, I fully accept what you say, Mr. Day. But it doesn't alter the fact that I'm very depressed, because I do not see how you can have peace in Northern Ireland unless you have something like power sharing.
Final comment from you, Mr. Powell.
Simply that I'm not depressed. I'm sorry that Lord O'Neill is, but one can understand that.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. And we look forward to you reappearing in Parliament, whatever any individual person may think of your particular views.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Well, now, that was a very interesting exchange. Mr. Powell, I think, has plainly had a very long day, wouldn't you say, David?
I thought it was one of the most extraordinary kinds of exchange and interview. I don't pretend to understand Ulster politics. I think I understand a little less after that exchange.
Well, Mr. Powell clearly means to put his stamp, if he can, on the United Ulster Unionist Party, and there's no doubt that that is one section of the House of Commons that will deserve close watching in the days and weeks ahead. We are still watching down at Smith Square to see if there is any word, apart from minor incursions and excursions from the party offices, to know whether any of the great men there are going to feel inclined to make an announcement or to let something be known about what their intentions are. I don't think we need expect anything particular from Mr. Wilson now. Remember that he said this afternoon that he was going to make his ministerial broadcast on Monday, and there he is to outline his plans for putting the country right after this general election. It's difficult to know precisely what Mr. Wilson can say in that sort of talk. Labour Party has, after all, been elected on a particular election agenda, and there are, I think, a number of people in the Labour Party who, of course, would not want Mr. Wilson to depart from the terms of Labour's agenda. And unless Mr. Wilson does, I would have supposed that it was still going to be very difficult to persuade the Conservatives, in the light, for example, of Sir Alec Douglas-Hume's reaction, and indeed Mr. Whitelaw's reaction, to bring them in. And equally, I thought from what Mr. Thorpe had said this morning, he too would be looking very sceptically at any initiative of that kind by Mr. Wilson. But maybe Mr. Wilson doesn't intend to look at politics. He clearly is going to talk not only to the unions, but to employers. And very clearly, one of the points that are going to be made and hammered home now, even more than it was during the general election, is that the country now faces the gravest economic crisis since the war. Now, the man who said that most openly, I think, during the course of the last election campaign, certainly during its closing stages, was Mr. Heath. And we still haven't heard from Mr. Heath. Martin Bell is down at Conservative Central Office there in Smith Square. Martin, is there any word of Mr. Heath's movements and intentions?
Yes, there is some. He's been in here now for 50 minutes. He started off with a 10-minute talk to party workers, which was private, I gather straight from the shoulder. He got a standing ovation at it, and that's all that we know. From there, he went upstairs to the executive offices, and we're expecting him down at any minute. But we have been told that he's not going to talk to the press, he's not going to talk to television. One possible reason for this, I've been told by a very reliable source, is that he wants a day or two to think things over. Now, I asked this informant whether those things included his own position, and the informant replied, of course, this was one of the things he had to think about.
Well, that was Martin Bell, and that's the inside story of Mr. Heath and what's going to occupy his attention at leisure. It is perhaps one of the advantages of having an overall majority that the men who have got to work out the political decisions actually do have a day or two in which they can make up their minds. If it had been thrown absolutely again into a minority situation, very tired men who had been slanging each other up and down the country during an election would then have been meant to come together, order their thoughts and find some way of running the country. In case you are just coming in, you've been out shopping or out at work or switched on the television now, you may be interested to hear what Mr. Wilson did say this afternoon when he spoke to the party workers at Transport House on the result of the election and his intentions in the days ahead.
And now, as the echoes of the hustings die away, it is manifestly essential in the wider national interest that Parliament should now give a lead to the country. For whatever has divided us in this keenly fought election campaign, we have all agreed that Britain faces, and has indeed for a considerable time been facing, the gravest economic crisis since the war. And everyone in industry and in our wider national family now needs to work together, sharing the effort and sharing the burdens of Britain's economic fight. On Monday, I hope to make a ministerial broadcast expressing to all our people, however they may have voted, whatever their political affiliations or those of no political affiliations, what, in the view of the government, must now be done in order to put the country right again and bring us through to a real economic security and advance.
Well, those words from Mr. Wilson were obviously aimed at a wider audience than just the typists and secretaries and helpers.
So putting the country right again, that is plainly Mr. Wilson's programme, and no doubt the programme of many people up and down the country in the days and weeks ahead. I think the country perhaps still has to learn the full dimensions of the problem. We have heard during the course of today from industrialists and from trade union leaders of their fears. And now what the country needs to know are the remedies which will actually be put in practice. Until this election was over, the second general election of 1974, it was not possible for a government to take the sort of action that it wished. And the election is now over, giving Labour an overall majority, but perhaps the most narrow one of all. And first of all, David, your reactions.
Well, I think it has been a very uniform election for the 6th time in 9 elections. We've had a cliffhanger. I don't think it'll be 5 years before we're here again. I think there'll be a lot of lessons to analyse out of this election and to think about. I think we shall be having probably a referendum on the common market within a year. I think we shall have a very fraught political time. This is not an assured majority, but it's an adequate majority. I think it'll probably be at least a year before we come to this position again.
And now, Bob, in the battleground?
Well, having in mind the fact that I think the opposition is more badly divided as between the various sections than really since the war, for a very long time before that, I think Mr. Wilson has quite a good chance of governing effectively for a year, 2 years, or perhaps even longer. Just to remind you finally, there was a swing of just over 2%, and it worked. The dear old swingometer worked very well indeed, although the Tories were able to counterattack effectively in a row of seats across the bottom. And one big paradrop occurred here. As far as the Liberals are concerned, they didn't take off, although they still got a very powerful vote of over 18%. The Scott Nats were on the very verge of taking off, but didn't quite make it either. They were at 30% and needed a few more percent to begin really to take off. But those are the stories, I think, of the long day's night.
And so, with Labour winning this second general election of 1974, from all of us, from Robin Day, Graham Pyatt, and from David Butler, Robert Mackenzie, we will give you now the Labour gains which made the election result what it is. Lincoln, Nelson and Cone, Rossendale, Oxford, Rochester and Chatham, Southampton Test, Ipswich, Bolton West, Ilford North, Peterborough, Bristol North West, Birmingham Selly Oak, Leicester South. Welling and Hatfield, Bury and Ratcliffe, Hemel Hempstead, Berwick and East Lothian, Lichfield and Tamworth, Blythe. The result of the Labour's victory in the general election, a cast of thousands. The second general election over, and what it means for all of us in the days and weeks ahead is now to be unfolded. Good afternoon.